Welcome to another video on stories of our history. The ancient world was a place where the boundary between the waking world and the realm of dreams was perilously thin, a gossamer veil through which the gods were believed to send urgent, cryptic messages to mortals, and no dream in the annals of antiquity was more consequential, more terrifying, or more thoroughly documented by the father of history, Herodotus, than the nightmare that tormented the sleep of Astyages, the last king of the Median Empire. Astyages, whose name in Old Iranian, Arsti meant spear thrower, was the son of Cyrus, the brilliant warrior king who had shattered the Assyrian Empire and forged the Medes into the dominant power of the Near East. He inherited a vast and prosperous realm around 585 BC, an empire that stretched from the Halys River in Anatolia to the borders of the Parthian steppes, a kingdom of formidable mountain fortresses, magnificent Nicaean horses, and a sophisticated court centered on the legendary capital of Ecbatana, modern-day Hamadan, a city said to be ringed by 7 concentric, rainbow-hued walls, the innermost blazing with gold and silver. For much of his early reign, Astyages governed with the heavy, secure authority of a dynastic heir, his kingdom a seemingly unshakable edifice built on the military genius of his father and the feudal loyalty of the Iranian tribes, including the Persians, who were his vassals in the rugged southern highlands of Anshan. But this serene, imperial facade was shattered one night by a vision so potent, so dripping with ominous symbolism, that it would send the king spiraling into a vortex of paranoia, cruelty, and catastrophic miscalculation, ultimately delivering his throne to an infant grandson and setting the stage for the rise of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. The initial dream that set this terrible chain of events in motion is described by Herodotus with the vivid, almost cinematic, detail that characterizes his entire account of the Median royal house. Astyages had a daughter named Mandane, a princess of the Median bloodline, whose name is linguistically linked to the concept of staying, or remaining, an ironic designation for a woman whose offspring would uproot an empire. In the dream, Astyages saw Mandane urinate so copiously that the golden stream not only flooded the whole of Ecbatana but surged outward to cover the entire continent of Asia, a torrent of liquid that was, at once, a symbol of life-giving fertility and a terrifying omen of uncontrollable, world-spanning power. The king, deeply disturbed, summoned the most authoritative interpreters of the supernatural available to him, the Magi, the hereditary Median priestly caste who were the keepers of sacred wisdom, the custodians of the fire temples, and the trusted advisors on all matters of divine communication. The Magi, a group whose very name would later give the world the word magic, were not mere court soothsayers. They were the intellectual elite of the Median state, men trained in the intricate art of oniromancy, the interpretation of dreams, a discipline that had been refined in the Near East for millennia and was recorded in extensive cuneiform manuals that catalogued the symbolic meanings of every conceivable dream image. They listened gravely to the king's account and delivered their chilling verdict. The dream signified that Mandane's offspring would one day reign as king, and not just as a local ruler but as a sovereign of such immense power that his dominion would overflow all boundaries and flood the entire known world, eclipsing the Median throne and submerging the glory of Astyages beneath a tide of Persian ascendancy. The immediate, practical decision that Astyages made in the wake of this terrifying interpretation was, from the cold-blooded perspective of dynastic security, a perfectly rational but ultimately self-defeating maneuver. Mandane was of marriageable age, and a bride of the royal house was the most potent political asset a king could possess. Her marriage would normally be orchestrated to create a powerful alliance with a neighboring king or to bind a powerful Median noble family even more closely to the throne. However, the prophecy transformed her from a prized asset into a biological time bomb, a vessel for a future usurper. Astyages, determined to neutralize the threat without incurring the religious pollution of direct kinslaying, carefully selected a husband for Mandane who was, in his estimation, entirely incapable of posing a threat to the Median crown. He chose Cambyses I, the king of Anshan, a ruler of the Persians, a vassal people who had been subordinate to the Medes since the conquests of Phraortes. The Persians, in the eyes of the Median court, were a less powerful, less sophisticated, and securely subservient branch of the Iranian family. A match between Mandain and a Persian king, rather than a mighty Median noble or a rival Anatolian monarch, would, Astyages reasoned, be a socially demeaning union that would permanently taint the status of any offspring and render them politically irrelevant. Herodotus notes, with pointed irony, that Astyages considered a Persian much lower than a Mede of the middle rank, a fatal underestimation that would prove to be the psychological and political seed of his own destruction. The marriage was solemnized, Mandain departed for the rugged, remote highlands of Anshan, and Astyages likely believed he had prudently buried the dark prophecy in the obscurity of a provincial backwater. The deceptive calm that followed Mandain's departure was, however, abruptly and violently shattered a year later when a second, even more terrifying dream assailed the king in his bedchamber. This time, the image was not of liquid inundation but of rampant, unstoppable botanical growth. Astyages dreamt that from the womb of his daughter Mandain there sprouted a gigantic, supernatural vine, a single, monstrous tendril that grew with impossible speed and vigor, extending its leafy shoots and its twining stems not merely across the palace or the city but across the entire vast expanse of the Asian continent, throwing its shadow over every kingdom and smothering all other powers in its relentless, verdant embrace. The king awoke in a cold sweat, his mind reeling from the sheer, visceral power of the image. The vine, in the symbolic lexicon of the ancient Near East, was a powerful emblem of royalty, life, and universal dominion. It was carved into the reliefs of Assyrian palaces and woven into the iconography of divine kingship. The Magi were once again summoned, and this time their interpretation was even more direct, more urgent, and more terrifying than before. There was no ambiguity, no room for symbolic loopholes. The dream meant, they solemnly informed the shaken king, that the son who would be born from Mandain was not merely destined to rule, but that he would rule in the place of Astyages, that he would supplant the Median dynasty entirely, and that his power would extend, irresistible and absolute, across the entire world. The prophecy was no longer a distant, abstract threat, it had become an immediate, dynastic death sentence, and the child who would execute it was already growing in Mandain's womb. The reaction of Astyages to this second, unequivocal prophecy was a classic illustration of the tragic pattern that the Greeks called hubris, the arrogant, doomed attempt of a mortal to defy a divinely ordained fate. The king, who had spent his entire life in the absolute security of his inherited power, surrounded by the 7 walls of Ecbatana and the obeisance of his subjects, could not accept that a higher, cosmic will had already decreed his downfall. He resolved to take matters into his own hands, to use his royal authority to physically and violently nullify the prophecy by killing the infant who was destined to destroy him. He dispatched a trusted messenger to the distant Persian court in Anshan, ordering that Mandain, now heavily pregnant, be brought back to the Median capital under heavy guard, ostensibly so that he could be present for the birth of his grandchild. When Mandain arrived at the palace and soon after gave birth to a healthy, vigorous son, whom she named Cyrus, Astyages did not hesitate. He was not, by any ancient standard, an unusually cruel man, but the logic of power, combined with the visceral terror of a nightmare, overrode any sentiment of familial affection. He summoned Harpagus, a high-ranking member of the Median royal clan, a trusted general and courtier who was, according to Herodotus, the most faithful of the Medes, a man bound to the king by oaths of loyalty and the shared blood of their noble lineage. To Harpagus, Astyages issued a direct, chilling command that could not be misconstrued, a command that would set in motion all the bloodshed and betrayal to come. Take the child born of Mandain, my daughter, to your own house and there kill it. Then you may bury it in whatever manner you yourself please. The stark, brutal command that Harpagus received from his king, the sovereign whom he had served faithfully and who was, moreover, his own kinsman by blood, threw the Median general into a profound and agonizing moral and political crisis, a moment of decision that would reverberate through the corridors of history. Harpagus returned to his own palatial residence, the infant Cyrus cradled in his arms, and his heart, as Herodotus recounts with a rare and poignant psychological insight, was overwhelmed with a storm of conflicting emotions. He was not a man of unreflective brutality. He was a seasoned courtier who had navigated the treacherous currents of the Median court for decades, and he understood, with a cold, visceral clarity, the multiple, razor-sharp dangers that now surrounded him. The first and most immediate danger was the king's wrath. If he disobeyed the direct order of Astyages, he was committing an act of open treason that would result in the most horrific torture and execution for himself and the complete annihilation of his entire family, a fate that the annals of Near Eastern history demonstrated was not an idle threat but a routine procedure for the destruction of disgraced nobles. The second danger, more subtle but equally terrifying in its long-term implications, was the wrath of the Princess Mandain. If, as the prophecy foretold, the child Cyrus was indeed destined for a great and powerful future, and if Mandain ever discovered that Harpagus had been the instrument of her son's murder, her vengeance, particularly if her son were to somehow ascend to power despite the king's efforts, would be unspeakable, and Harpagus's own offspring would be the first targets of her grief-fueled retribution. And the third danger, the one that kept him awake at night, was the possibility that the king himself, in a fit of capricious tyranny or in an attempt to absolve himself of the religious pollution of kinslaying, might later deny the order and make a scapegoat of Harpagus, punishing him for the very act he had been commanded to perform. The resolution that Harpagus devised was a masterpiece of courtly evasion, a calculated decision to delegate the direct act of murder to another, thereby distancing himself from the immediate blood guilt while still, in a technical sense, obeying the king's command. He summoned one of the king's own slaves, a herdsman named Mithridates, whose name in Old Persian means, given by Mitra, and who grazed his cattle on the rugged, mountainous pastures north of Ecbatana, a region teeming with wild beasts, wolves, and leopards, which would provide a plausible, natural explanation for the death of an infant. Harpagus did not mince words. He placed the infant Cyrus, dressed in the richly embroidered royal garments that marked his status, into the arms of the rough, bewildered herdsman and gave him the order with brutal clarity, as recorded by Herodotus. Astyages commands you to expose this infant on the wildest part of the mountains, and to stay there and watch until it is dead. And if you do not kill it, but let it live in any way, the king will have you put to death by the most horrible torture. The herdsman, a simple man who was utterly powerless in the face of the royal will, could only obey. He took the infant, still blissfully unaware of the death sentence that had been pronounced upon him, and began the long, sorrowful journey back to his humble cottage in the highlands, carrying in his arms the future king of the world, a child who had been condemned to die by his own grandfather. The arrival of Mithridates at his small, mud-brick dwelling on the remote mountainside was a moment of profound and unexpected synchronicity that would alter the course of history, a twist of fate that the Greek tragedians would have recognized as the inescapable machinery of divine intervention. As he approached his home, his mind clouded with the terrible burden of the royal command, he met his wife, whose name, in a detail that Herodotus pointedly records, was Spako, which is the Median word for a female dog. Spako was in a state of acute distress, for during her husband's absence, she had gone into labor and had given birth, but the child, unlike the healthy, vigorous Cyrus, had been stillborn. The herdsman, seeing the lifeless body of his own son and the living, royal infant in his arms, immediately recognized the hand of Providence, the intervention of the gods who, as the Persians believed, guided the destiny of kings. He explained to his wife the entire, harrowing situation, the king's command, his own fear of Harpagus, the terrible punishment that awaited them if the infant prince were not killed. Spako, her maternal instincts already raw and bleeding from the loss of her own child, begged her husband, with all the fierce, desperate urgency of a mother, not to kill the beautiful, royal baby. The solution that presented itself was as elegant as it was morally ambiguous. They would dress the stillborn infant in the royal garments of Cyrus, expose the dead child on the remote mountain crag as commanded, and raise the living prince as their own son. The substitution was made, the poor, nameless dead child was left to the wild beasts, fulfilling the technical letter of the king's command, and Cyrus, the future lord of Asia, was placed in the rough, hand-hewn cradle of a Median herdsman, his true identity hidden beneath the coarse woolen garments of a peasant child, his royal blood pulsing unknown in the obscurity of the highlands. For 10 years, the young Cyrus grew and thrived in the clean, harsh air of the Median mountains, a child who was, by all outward appearances, the son of the herdsman Mithridates and his wife Spacco. He was raised among the cattle and the horses, learning the skills of riding, archery, and the rugged self-reliance that characterized the pastoralists of the Zagros, but his innate, regal nature, the inborn charisma and authority that the Greeks would later recognize as the hallmark of his character, could not be entirely suppressed by his humble environment. The village boys, who spent their days playing the rough, competitive games of childhood, naturally gravitated towards Cyrus as their leader, sensing in him a quality that set him apart from the other children. It was during one of these games, when Cyrus was 10 years of age, that the truth of his royal identity, which had been buried so carefully and for so long, suddenly and violently erupted into the open. The boys were playing at a game of king, a mimicry of the adult political world they observed from a distance, and the charismatic, commanding Cyrus was naturally chosen by his playmates to be their sovereign. He assigned roles to the other children with the easy authority of a born ruler. Some were his bodyguards, some were his messengers, some were to build his palace of stones. But one boy, the son of a proud and high-ranking Median nobleman named Artabares, refused to obey the orders of the peasant boy Cyrus. The child, used to the deference that his family's status commanded, considered it beneath his dignity to submit to the son of a lowly herdsman. Cyrus, acting with the absolute, unquestioning authority of a king, ordered that the insubordinate noble boy be seized and beaten, a punishment that was immediately and enthusiastically administered by the other children. The boy, smarting from the physical pain and, even more acutely, from the profound humiliation of being publicly chastised by a social inferior, ran home to his father Artabares in the city and displayed his bruises, his young voice trembling with outrage and indignation. Artabares, a man of considerable wealth and status in the Median court, was enraged that his son should be treated with such violence by a mere slave, a peasant child. He took his son immediately to the royal palace and demanded an audience with King Astyages himself, seeking justice and the severe punishment of the insolent herdsboy who had dared to lay hands on a nobleman's son. Astyages, who was ever sensitive to the privileges of the noble class upon which his power rested, summoned the boy Cyrus and his supposed father Mithridates to the palace to answer for the offense. When the young Cyrus, dressed in his rough peasant clothes but standing with an unbroken, regal bearing, was brought into the magnificent presence of the king of the Medes, surrounded by the gold and silver of Ecbatana's innermost court, Astyages was immediately and profoundly struck by the boy. There was something in the child's face, in the shape of his features, in the calm, unapologetic way he met the king's gaze, that stirred a deep, unsettling, and terrifying sense of recognition in the depths of the king's memory. Herodotus describes the moment with a masterful narrative instinct, noting that Astyages fixed his eyes upon the boy and, after a long, searching silence, felt a sense of recognition wash over him, a cold dread that the face of the peasant child was, in some impossible and horrifying way, his own face, the face of his daughter Manaine, the face of the royal bloodline that he had tried to extinguish. The psychological torment that now gripped Astyages in his throne room at Ecbatana was the agonizing, terrifying process of a king who had believed himself to be the master of fate, the supreme autocrat who could, by a simple exercise of his absolute will, countermand the decrees of the gods, and who was now confronted with the shattering possibility that his will had been thwarted. That the divine prophecy he had tried to annihilate had, with an almost mocking inevitability, survived and was standing before him, healthy, confident, and unbowed. He could not immediately act upon his suspicions, for to do so would be to publicly confess his own monstrous crime and his profound violation of the sacred bonds of kinship that were the foundation of the Median royal ideology. He dismissed the outraged Artabares with the promise of justice, telling him that he would deal with the matter privately, and then, turning to his guards, he ordered the terrified herdsman Mithridates to be seized and brought to a private chamber for a harsh and intensive interrogation. The soldiers seized the trembling cowherd and dragged him away from his young charge, and the pressure of the king's absolute authority, combined with the threat of the most gruesome tortures that the Median executioners could devise, soon broke through any resolve that the simple man possessed. Under the relentless questioning of the king, Mithridates, his voice trembling and his eyes wide with terror, confessed the entire truth: the command of Harpagus, the stillbirth of his own son, the substitution of the infants on the desolate mountainside, and the 10 years of secret, hidden life that the boy Cyrus had lived as his own son. The terrible, inescapable reality now lay exposed before Astyages like a gaping wound. Cyrus was alive. The prophecy, the dream of the vine, the nightmare of the golden flood, had all come true, not in spite of his efforts but with a cruel, cosmic irony, because of them. The immediate, burning rage of Astyages was directed not at the herdsman, who was, after all, a mere helpless instrument of a larger betrayal, but at the man he had trusted above all others, the man to whom he had entrusted the execution of his direct, royal command, Harpagus. The king, however, was a master of the dissimulation that was essential for survival in the Byzantine intrigues of the ancient Near Eastern court. He did not immediately summon Harpagus and denounce his treason. Instead, he presented a mask of serene, almost benevolent calm, concealing the white-hot core of his fury behind a carefully constructed facade of paternal forgiveness and gratitude. He sent for Harpagus and, when the general arrived, Astyages told him, with a smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes, that the whole affair with the infant Cyrus had turned out for the best, that the gods had miraculously preserved the boy, and that he, the king, wished to celebrate the deliverance of his grandson with a great sacrificial feast. He ordered Harpagus to send his own young son, a boy of about 13 years of age whose name Herodotus records as a son of Harpagus but does not specifically name in the immediate passage, to the palace to be a companion to the newly discovered prince, and to prepare himself to attend a banquet that very evening, a banquet at which the king would express his joy and his forgiveness. Harpagus, relieved beyond measure that his own life had been spared and that the king appeared to have accepted the survival of Cyrus without the expected explosion of lethal rage, returned to his house in a state of profound gratitude, and he immediately sent his beloved son, an innocent, unsuspecting boy, to the palace as commanded, walking unknowingly into a horror that would surpass the darkest nightmares of the ancient world. What followed in the palace kitchens of Ecbatana that afternoon was an act of such premeditated, cold-blooded cruelty that it would forever stain the name of Astyages in the annals of human history, and would serve as the ultimate catalyst for the destruction of his dynasty. The young son of Harpagus, upon arriving at the palace, was not welcomed with the festive preparations of a celebratory banquet. Instead, he was seized by the royal guards, dragged to a secluded chamber, and there, under the direct supervision of the king himself, was butchered like a sacrificial animal. The body of the innocent boy was dismembered, the limbs and the torso separated, and the flesh, according to the chilling, detailed account preserved by Herodotus, was then prepared for a gruesome culinary purpose. Portions of the boy's flesh were roasted over the palace fires, while other parts were boiled in great copper cauldrons, the savory aroma of cooking meat drifting through the corridors of the palace, a macabre, unsuspecting prelude to the evening's festivities. The king, his face a mask of unreadable, terrifying tranquility, supervised the preparations personally, a monarch transformed by his paranoid rage into a demonic chef, carefully ensuring that the ghastly meal would be presented in the most exquisite, appetizing manner, plated on golden dishes and garnished with the finest herbs and spices that the royal kitchens could provide. The other nobles who were invited to the banquet, including the unsuspecting Harpagus, were served a perfectly ordinary meal of lamb and beef, a detail of chilling, calculated cruelty that isolated the general and his singular, unknowing horror. As the banquet commenced in the glittering, torch-lit hall of the Ecbatana palace, the atmosphere was initially one of forced conviviality, the median nobles reclining on their embroidered couches, drinking the sweet, strong wine of the Zagros vineyards, and exchanging the polite, guarded conversation of the court. Harpagus, still basking in the relief of the king's apparent clemency, ate heartily and drank deeply, his heart light with the belief that he had miraculously survived a fatal political crisis and that his son was even now a favored companion of the young prince. He consumed the meat that was placed before him on the golden platters, complimenting the king on the exquisite flavor and the tender preparation of the dish, blissfully unaware of the true nature of the feast. When the main course was finished and the bones were cleared away by the silent, watchful servants, Astyages, his eyes glittering with a terrible, triumphant malice, asked Harpagus how he had enjoyed his meal. Harpagus replied with sincere and lavish praise, expressing his deep satisfaction with the excellent and unusual meat. It was at this precise, devastating moment that Astyages, with a cruelty that was almost theatrical in its orchestration, gave a prearranged signal to the servants, who brought forward a covered basket and placed it before the general. When the lid of the basket was lifted, Harpagus looked inside and saw, arranged in a grotesque and unmistakable tableau, the head, the hands, and the feet of his own murdered son, the grisly, indisputable evidence of the meal he had just consumed. The horror of the Thyestean banquet, a motif that would echo through Greek tragedy and Roman literature, was not a myth. It was a calculated act of royal vengeance, a punishment for Harpagus's disobedience that was designed to be as psychologically annihilating as it was physically sickening. The reaction of Harpagus to this unimaginable atrocity was, according to the account of Herodotus, a masterclass in the iron self-control that was required for survival in the pitiless world of Near Eastern court politics. He did not vomit. He did not scream. He did not leap from his couch and attempt to strangle the king with his bare hands, a suicidal gesture that would have resulted in his own immediate execution and the annihilation of his entire surviving family. Instead, with a superhuman effort of will that must have torn his soul to pieces, he composed his features into a mask of stoic, unreadable acceptance, and he quietly, almost humbly, acknowledged the king's justice. He had been granted a terrible gift, the king informed him, a punishment that was measured and proportionate to his treason, and now the score between them was settled. Astyages, in his own twisted logic, had satisfied his vengeance, had restored the balance of fear and obedience upon which his rule depended, and had demonstrated, in the most graphic terms imaginable, the lethal consequences of disobedience. He dismissed Harpagus from the banquet, allowing the shattered, hollow-eyed general to collect the grotesque remains of his son and return to his home, a man who had been hollowed out by grief and who was now, beneath his calm exterior, a cauldron of slowly simmering, implacable, and eternally patient hatred. The king had satisfied his immediate, visceral need for revenge, but he had, in the process, created a secret, dedicated enemy at the very heart of his own court, a man who would wait for years, nursing his rage in silence, for the precise moment when he could exact a retribution that would bring the entire Median Empire crashing down in ruins. In the aftermath of the horrific banquet, the young Cyrus, whose royal identity had now been dramatically and violently exposed, was not, as one might expect, thrown into a dungeon or secretly executed to finally eliminate the prophetic threat. Astyages, having satisfied his immediate rage on the innocent son of Harpagus, found himself in a peculiar and constraining position. The Magi, whom he once again consulted regarding the fate of the boy, now offered a different, more nuanced, and, as it would transpire, fatally flawed interpretation of the original prophecy. They argued, with the clever, self-interested casuistry of a priestly caste that was always eager to maintain its influence, that the dream of the vine and the flood had already been fulfilled in the childhood game of kings that Cyrus had played among the village boys. The boy had already been a king, they reasoned, in that innocent, childlike mockery of royal authority, and therefore, the divine decree had been symbolically satisfied. The danger of his one day ruling in actual, political fact was, they claimed, now past. The Magi, who were keenly aware of the immense power they wielded as the interpreters of dreams and who may have secretly feared that a further attempt on the life of the miraculously preserved Cyrus would bring a divine retribution that they could not control, advised the king to send the boy away from the court, back to the distant obscurity of his biological parents in Persia, where he would pose no further threat. Astyages, who was emotionally exhausted by the entire, horrific affair and who was perhaps secretly relieved to have the prophetically dangerous child removed from his immediate presence without incurring further religious pollution, accepted this convenient, face-saving interpretation. Cyrus was permitted to leave Ecbatana and return to the land of Anshan, to the court of his true father, Cambyses I, and his mother, Manane, who had long believed her infant son to be dead, a reunion that must have been a moment of profound and bewildering joy. The departure of Cyrus for the remote Persian highlands in the south was, from Astyages' perspective, a resolution that removed the immediate, visceral threat of the prophecy from his daily life, allowing him to sink back into the comfortable routines of despotic rule. But it was a resolution that had unwittingly planted the seed of his destruction in the most fertile possible soil. Cyrus, now a young man on the cusp of adulthood, was not merely a Persian prince. He was a prince who had been forged by an extraordinary and unique set of experiences. He had known the harsh, authentic life of a Median herdsman, an experience that connected him to the rugged, independent warrior traditions of the Iranian tribes in a way that no palace-raised noble could ever replicate. He had been touched, as his miraculous survival seemed to prove, by a special divine favor, a charisma of destiny that was the most powerful form of political legitimacy in the ancient world. And he had been educated, through the stark, brutal object lesson of the Harpagus affair, in the true, pitiless nature of the Median court, a place where a grandfather could order the murder of an infant, and then mutilate and cannibalize the son of his most loyal servant. When Cyrus arrived in Anshan, he was not a frightened refugee. He was a young man with a burning sense of his own exceptional destiny, a destiny that had been publicly announced by the Magi, confirmed by his miraculous survival, and was now quietly encouraged by a network of nobles in the Median heartland who had been horrified by the feast of Harpagus, and who saw in Cyrus a potential liberator from the increasingly erratic tyranny of Astyages. The chief architect of the conspiracy that would eventually topple Astyages was, with a grim and poetic justice, the very man whom the king had so grievously wronged, Harpagus. For years, the Median general had lived in the shadow of his murdered son, his face a carefully maintained mask of loyal servitude, while his heart was a cauldron of corrosive, patient, and implacable vengeance. Harpagus, as a high-ranking noble with extensive estates, a network of military clients, and a deep knowledge of the internal political landscape of the Median court, was perfectly positioned to orchestrate a slow, silent, but irresistible campaign of sedition. He could not openly move against the king, for the royal guard and the loyalist noble factions still held the immediate levers of military power in Ecbatana. But Harpagus was a master of the indirect approach. Through a secret, clandestine correspondence, conducted with messengers who carried oral communications to avoid the danger of written evidence, Harpagus began to cultivate the ambition and the resolve of the young Cyrus in distant Persia. He sent messages that artfully appealed to Cyrus's pride, his sense of destiny, and his legitimate grievance against the tyrannical grandfather who had tried to murder him in his cradle. He reminded Cyrus of the prophecy, of the divine favor that had preserved him, and of the widespread discontent among the Median nobility, a discontent that Harpagus himself, through years of patient, whispered persuasion, had carefully fomented. He promised that when the time was ripe for rebellion, a significant portion of the Median army, under his own clandestine influence, would defect to the Persian cause. The method by which Harpagus communicated his secret, treasonous messages to Cyrus in Anshan, given the extreme danger of interception by the king's spies, was a stroke of ingenuity that has become legendary in the annals of espionage. According to the narrative preserved by Herodotus, Harpagus could not risk sending a written letter, for the roads were watched, and any messenger carrying a suspicious document would be stopped and searched. Instead, he conceived of a tactic that used the body of a living animal as a secret courier. He took a hare, a common game animal that a hunter would legitimately carry across the countryside, and he carefully disemboweled it, removing its internal organs but leaving the skin and fur intact. Inside the cavity of the hare's body, he concealed a letter, written on a thin, tightly rolled strip of parchment, detailing his promise of support and his plan for the Median noble defection. He then sewed the hare's belly closed, so that the animal appeared to be an ordinary, freshly killed hunting trophy. The messenger, a trusted servant of Harpagus disguised as a hunter, carried the hare openly, along with a hunting net, across the long and perilous road from the Median heartland to the Persian capital of Anshan, passing through the checkpoints of the king without arousing suspicion. When the messenger arrived at the court of Cyrus and presented the hare, the young Persian prince, alerted beforehand to expect a secret communication, carefully cut open the animal's belly and discovered the hidden parchment, the physical, tangible evidence of the conspiracy that would change the world. The hare, a humble creature of the field, had become the carrier of an empire's fate. The reception of this secret letter, and the subsequent series of clandestine communications that followed, galvanized the young Cyrus into a resolution that would alter the course of history. He was now fully aware that he was not merely a disaffected vassal with a personal grievance. He was the focal point of a far-reaching conspiracy that extended into the highest echelons of the Median military and nobility. The promises of Harpagus, a man whose reputation and influence were well known, provided the crucial assurance that a rebellion against the mighty Median Empire was not a suicidal fantasy but a calculated political risk with a genuine chance of success. Cyrus began, with the methodical, strategic patience that would later characterize all his imperial conquests, to prepare his own forces and to consolidate his political support among the Persian tribes. He summoned the chieftains of the various Persian clans to an assembly, and through a combination of charismatic oratory, appeals to their pride, and a stark, realistic assessment of the opportunity presented by the Median internal divisions, he persuaded them to unite behind his cause and to renounce their vassalage to Astyages. The Persians, who had for decades been the subordinate junior partners of the Medes, were now offered the chance to become the dominant power in the Iranian world, and the ancient, fierce independence of the highland tribes, dormant but not extinguished, was rekindled into a flame of revolutionary ardor. The stage was set, the alliances were secretly made, and the hour of the rebellion was fast approaching, an hour that would pit the aging, paranoid tyrant of Ecbatana against his miraculously preserved grandson, in a dynastic war that would determine the fate of an entire continent. The open rebellion of Cyrus against his grandfather Astyages erupted in the year 553 BC. According to the chronological framework provided by the Babylonian Chronicle of Nabonidus, a contemporary cuneiform source that provides an invaluable, non-Greek verification of the central events. Cyrus, having successfully united the Persian tribes under his leadership and secured the clandestine promises of support from Harpagus and the disaffected Median nobility, declared his independence from the Median crown and refused to remit the customary tribute. The act of rebellion was not a sudden, impulsive eruption. It was a meticulously planned and precisely timed political maneuver, designed to exploit the internal fissures that had been widening in the Median Empire under the erratic rule of Astyages. The king, when the news of the Persian revolt reached him at Ecbatana, reacted with the predictable, tyrannical fury of a despot whose authority had been directly challenged by an inferior. He did not initially comprehend the full scale of the conspiracy that had been woven around him. He saw only the insolent rebellion of a minor vassal king, a problem that could be solved, as such problems had always been solved, by the overwhelming application of superior Median military force. Astyages issued a command for the mobilization of the full Median army and, according to the prophetic pattern that he had been trying to escape for decades, he made a single, catastrophic error of judgment. He placed the largest and most crucial contingent of this army under the command of Harpagus, the very man whose son he had butchered and fed to him, a decision of such staggering, blind arrogance that it can only be explained as a fatal combination of ingrained habit, the assumption of automatic obedience, and the king's utter inability to comprehend the depth of the hatred he had created. The initial military engagements of the rebellion were fought in the rugged, mountainous borderlands between the Persian heartland of Anshan and the southern periphery of the Median Empire, a terrain of narrow passes and defensible heights that favored the smaller, more agile Persian forces. The first major clash, known as the Battle of Harpagus, was a fiercely contested engagement in which the Persian army, under the direct, charismatic leadership of Cyrus, demonstrated a tactical discipline and a fighting spirit that far exceeded the expectations of the Median command. The Medes, who had initially advanced with the overconfident assurance of a superior imperial power disciplining a rebellious province, were met with a level of resistance that they had not anticipated. The Persian spearmen, wielding long, iron-tipped pikes, formed a solid defensive wall that blunted the initial Median cavalry charges, while the Persian archers, positioned on the higher ground of the mountain slopes, rained a devastating hail of arrows upon the attacking forces. The battle was long, bloody, and indecisive in its immediate tactical outcome, but it was a strategic victory of immense psychological importance for the Persians. They had proven, on the field of battle, that they could stand toe-to-toe with the legendary Median army, the army that had shattered the Assyrian Empire, and they had not been broken. The Battle of Harpagus sent a powerful and unmistakable message to the rest of the Iranian plateau. The Persian rebellion was not a minor border skirmish but a serious, dynastic war, and the young Cyrus was a commander of genuine, formidable talent. The second, and ultimately decisive, campaign of the rebellion occurred in 550 BC, when Astyages, now fully enraged and determined to personally crush the upstart Persian, mustered the entire remaining strength of the Median Empire and marched south into Persia at the head of a vast, imposing army. The Persian army, outnumbered but fighting on its own chosen ground and burning with the fierce, revolutionary conviction that they were fighting for their national destiny, met the Median host on the plains near the future site of the magnificent city of Pasargadae, which Cyrus would later found as the ceremonial capital of his new empire. The Battle of Pasargadae was not merely a clash of arms, it was a collision of two irreconcilable political orders, a dynastic war between a tyrannical grandfather and a divinely favored grandson, and its outcome was determined, with a grim, poetic justice, by the very act of cruelty that Astyages had perpetrated years earlier. The Median army, as it drew up its battle lines on the dusty plain, was a vast, colorful spectacle of tribal contingents, heavily armored cavalry, and disciplined infantry, a living representation of the empire that Cyrus had built. But within that imposing host, a cancer of treason had been secretly festering for years. Harpagus, who commanded a substantial portion of the Median battle line, had been waiting for this precise moment, the moment of ultimate, catastrophic revenge, for over a decade. At the critical, predetermined moment in the battle, when the two armies were locked in a desperate, grinding melee, Harpagus gave a signal, and a large, coordinated segment of the Median forces, following the prearranged plan, deliberately disengaged from the fight, either by refusing to advance, by withdrawing from the field, or, in a devastating act of betrayal, by turning their weapons against the still loyal Median units beside them. The defection of Harpagus and his contingent was a psychological and tactical earthquake that instantly shattered the cohesion of the Median army. The loyalist troops, who had been fighting fiercely against the Persians and who had believed that the numerical and qualitative superiority of their army would ultimately prevail, were suddenly plunged into a maelstrom of confusion, chaos, and panic. The carefully coordinated battle line disintegrated into a terrified, disorganized mob, as soldiers who moments before had been standing shoulder to shoulder turned upon one another in a paroxysm of fratricidal violence. The Persian forces, who had been informed in advance of the planned defection and who had been waiting for the decisive signal, seized the moment with aggressive, ruthless precision. Cyrus himself, at the head of his elite Persian cavalry, launched a furious, devastating charge directly into the gaping hole that the defection had torn in the Median center, driving deep into the heart of the shattered enemy formation. The rout was total and irrevocable. The army that had been the terror of the ancient world, the army that had destroyed Nineveh and humbled the Lydian kingdom, was now a scattered, fleeing rabble, pursued and slaughtered by the victorious Persians across the plains of Fars. The mighty Median Empire, which had seemed so invincible and so permanent, had collapsed in a single, cataclysmic afternoon, brought down not by an external invader but by the internal, corrosive poison of its king's own monstrous cruelty, a revenge that had been simmering for a decade and was finally served, cold and devastating, on the field of Pasargadae. The capture of Astyages in the aftermath of the battle was a moment of profound symbolic and political significance, a denouement that the Greek tradition portrays with a mixture of historical narrative and moralizing legend. The defeated king, who had fled the battlefield in a chariot as his empire crumbled around him, was captured alive by Cyrus and his soldiers. The ancient sources, both the Greek accounts of Herodotus and Astyages and the fragmentary evidence from the Babylonian Chronicle, agree that Cyrus, in a deliberate and masterful act of political propaganda, treated the vanquished Astyages not with the brutal, humiliating cruelty that was the standard practice of Assyrian and Babylonian conquerors, but with a calculated and magnanimous clemency. He spared the life of his grandfather, refusing to stain his new throne with the blood of his royal kinsmen, and he kept Astyages as an honored, though politically powerless, member of his court until the former king's death. This act of mercy was not a simple expression of familial affection. It was a brilliant and necessary political maneuver that served multiple, crucial functions. It demonstrated to the Median nobility that Cyrus was not a foreign barbarian but a legitimate, rightful heir to the Median throne, a king who would respect the established aristocracy and who would rule with justice and magnanimity rather than terror and vengeance. It nullified any potential Median resistance movement that might have coalesced around the person of the deposed king, for Astyages, alive and comfortable in Cyrus's court, was a symbol of reconciliation rather than a martyr for rebellion. And it presented Cyrus to the rest of the ancient Near East as a new kind of ruler, a king who had broken the ancient, brutal cycle of imperial conquest and genocide, a king who, according to the Persian imperial ideology that was now being forged, had been chosen by the supreme god Ahura Mazda to establish a reign of order and justice upon the earth. The immediate political consequence of the fall of Ecbatana and the capture of Astyages was not the destruction of the Median state, but its remarkably smooth, almost seamless, integration into the new political order that Cyrus was rapidly and brilliantly constructing. Cyrus, who had been raised in both the rugged simplicity of the Persian highlands and the sophisticated, treacherous environment of the Median court, understood with a profound, intuitive clarity that the empire he had just conquered was not a foreign enemy to be plundered and subjugated but the essential, senior partner in a broader Iranian imperial enterprise. The Median Empire, for all the tyranny of its last king, had been the first great Iranian imperial state, and its nobility, its military institutions, and its cultural prestige were indispensable assets that could not be squandered through a policy of punitive repression. In a masterstroke of political genius, Cyrus did not march into Ecbatana as a triumphant foreign conqueror, sacking the legendary city and impaling the Median nobles on stakes as the Assyrians would have done. Instead, he presented himself as the legitimate successor to the Median throne, the grandson of Astyages who had, through a combination of divine favor and his own martial virtue, deposed the tyrannical and unjust king and restored the ancient, righteous order of the Iranian monarchy. The Median capital of Ecbatana, with its 7 fabled walls and its magnificent, treasure-filled palaces, was not razed or abandoned. It was preserved and elevated as the summer royal residence of the new, united Perso-Median Empire, a status it would retain for the next 2 centuries. The integration of the Median military and administrative elite into the new regime was the most critical and delicate aspect of the transition, and Cyrus managed this process with a combination of generous co-optation and strategically deployed terror that left no doubt as to who was now the supreme authority. The Median nobles, who had witnessed the catastrophic defection and the total collapse of their army at Pasargadae, were in a state of profound shock and political vulnerability. Cyrus offered them a clear and attractive choice: accept his legitimate kingship, retain their lands, their titles, and their military commands, and become honored partners in the new imperial project, or resist and face the full, devastating consequences of Persian military power. The vast majority of the Median aristocracy, led by the influential and embittered Harpagus, chose the path of collaboration and were richly rewarded for their loyalty. Harpagus, whose patient, implacable revenge had been the essential catalyst for the entire revolution, was elevated to the highest echelons of the new imperial command, entrusted with the critical task of leading the Persian armies in the conquest of the western territories, including the Greek cities of Ionia and the kingdoms of Anatolia. The Medes, who had been the senior partners in the Iranian world, were now, in a dramatic reversal of fortune, the loyal and honored junior partners of the Persians, their formidable cavalry becoming the elite striking arm of the army that would soon conquer the known world. The administrative and cultural continuities that Cyrus deliberately preserved and promoted were profound, extending far beyond the mere retention of the Median capital and the co-optation of the nobility. The very title that Cyrus and all his Achaemenid successors would proudly bear, the Shahanshah, the King of Kings, was a Median political concept, a reflection of the feudal, multi-tiered sovereignty that the Medes had exercised over their diverse vassal kingdoms and tribal confederacies. The elaborate court protocol that would later so astonish Greek visitors to the Persian court, the ritual of proskynesis, the ceremonial robes, the hierarchical arrangement of courtiers, the use of a royal audience hall with the king enthroned in remote, inaccessible majesty, was largely Median in origin, a tradition that the Persians adopted, refined, and magnified to a scale befitting their world empire. The Magi, the Median priestly caste who had interpreted the fateful dreams of Astyages and who had been instrumental in the religious life of the Median court, were not suppressed. They were elevated to the position of the official priests of the Achaemenid state, the custodians of the sacred fire, the interpreters of divine omens, and the essential officiants at royal sacrifices. The Median language, closely related to Old Persian, continued to be spoken in the heartland, and Median loanwords, particularly in the realms of administration, court ceremony, and military terminology, entered the Old Persian lexicon. The Achaemenid Empire was, in its deepest cultural and institutional fabric, a Perso-Median confederation, a union of the two great Iranian peoples, and the success and longevity of the empire were fundamentally dependent on the successful maintenance of this delicate and essential internal balance. The role of Harpagus in the consolidation of the new Achaemenid order and in the subsequent military expansion of the empire was immense, a testament to the way in which a deeply wronged man, once the instrument of a tyrant's cruelty, could become the indispensable architect of a new world order. After the dust of the rebellion had settled, Cyrus himself turned his strategic attention eastward, to the vast, wild, and dangerous frontier of Central Asia, where the Scythian and Massagetæ tribes posed a constant, menacing threat to the northeastern borders of the new empire. The conquest and pacification of the wealthy, complex, and strategically vital western regions, the Greek cities of the Ionian coast, the kingdoms of Korea and Lycia, and the remnants of the Lydian kingdom, required a commander of exceptional skill, ruthlessness, and political acumen. Cyrus turned to Harpagus, the man whose treachery had won him a throne, and entrusted him with the full, independent command of the Western theater of operations. It was a decision of audacious trust, but it was also a politically brilliant calculation. By granting Harpagus such immense power and military glory, Cyrus was binding the Median general and his extensive network of clients even more tightly to the new regime, giving them a vested, personal stake in the success and expansion of the Achaemenid Empire. Harpagus, for his part, pursued the western conquests with a relentless, methodical, and terrifying efficiency that reflected both his own considerable military talents and the deep, accumulated traditions of Median siegecraft and combined arms warfare. The campaign of Harpagus in Ionia and Anatolia, which unfolded over the course of several years in the mid-540s BC, was a brutal and decisive demonstration of the military power that the new Perso-Median state could now project across the entire Near East. The Greek cities of the Ionian coast, which had been independent since the fall of the Lydian kingdom, were reduced one by one through a combination of massive earthwork ramps that overcame their formidable stone walls, relentless blockades by the newly acquired Phoenician navy, and the terrifying use of psychological warfare. The city of Phocaea, a major maritime power, was besieged, and its entire population, rather than submit to Persian domination, made the tragic and heroic decision to abandon their ancestral city, loading their families and possessions onto their ships and sailing into the unknown waters of the western Mediterranean, a diaspora that would eventually found the colony of Massalia, modern-day Marseilles in France. The Carians and the Lycians, fierce, independent mountain peoples who had resisted all previous conquerors, were subdued in a series of savage, grinding campaigns, their mountain fortresses assaulted and their warriors annihilated. Harpagus, the Mede, had become the iron fist of the Persian king, the instrument of a new world order that was being forged in blood and fire across the entire expanse of the Near East. The son of the man who had been fed his own child's flesh had, through the cold, patient, and utterly devastating machinery of imperial conquest, exacted a revenge upon the old order that was beyond anything even his vengeful heart could have initially imagined. The historical reliability of the entire magnificent, horrifying, and deeply dramatic narrative of Astyages, the prophetic dreams, the exposed infant, the Thyestean banquet, and the revolt of Cyrus has been a subject of intense and meticulous scholarly debate for over a century, raising fundamental questions about the nature of the sources and the very possibility of reconstructing the internal political history of the Median Empire. The account that we have, in its richest and most compelling detail, comes from the histories of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, a Greek writer who composed his work in the mid-5th century BC, approximately a century after the events he describes. Herodotus was not a contemporary witness, he was a traveler, a collector of oral traditions, and a master storyteller who wove together the accounts he heard from various informants into a cohesive, moralizing, and profoundly engaging narrative tapestry. The story of Astyages and Cyrus bears all the unmistakable hallmarks of a cross-cultural, trans-historical legend, a heroic biography, that shares profound structural similarities with other ancient foundational myths. The motif of the wicked king who is warned by a prophetic dream of the birth of a child who will overthrow him, his attempt to kill the infant, the child's miraculous survival through exposure or substitution, and his eventual return to claim his rightful throne, is a story pattern that appears in the legend of Sargon of Akkad in the 23rd century BC, the biblical account of Moses in the book of Exodus, the Greek myth of Oedipus, and the Roman legend of Romulus and Remus. The presence of this powerful, archetypal narrative pattern does not necessarily mean that the story of Astyages and Cyrus is entirely fictional, but it does demand that we approach the Herodotian account with a critical, analytical eye, recognizing that the historical events have been shaped, embellished, and mythologized to serve both narrative and ideological purposes. The contemporary, non-Greek sources that provide a crucial check on the Herodotian narrative are, unfortunately, sparse, fragmentary, and often maddeningly terse. The most important of these is the Babylonian Chronicle of Nabonidus, a cuneiform clay tablet that records, in a dry, analytic style, the major political and military events of the Neo-Babylonian period. For the year 550 BC, the chronicle contains an entry of immense historical significance. King Astyages mustered his army and marched against Cyrus, king of Anshan, for conquest. The army of Astyages revolted against him, and delivered him bound to Cyrus. Cyrus marched against Ecbatana, the royal city. Silver, gold, goods, and property of Ecbatana he carried off as spoil. This contemporary Babylonian account provides an independent, third-party verification of the central, indisputable historical facts, that Astyages was the king of the Medes, that Cyrus was the king of Anshan, the Persian vassal kingdom, that Astyages marched against Cyrus, that his army revolted, that Astyages was captured, and that Cyrus went on to conquer Ecbatana. The Babylonian text, notably, makes no mention of dreams, infant exposure, or cannibalistic feasts. It simply records the military and political facts. The presence of a revolt within the Median army, however, is a detail that aligns remarkably well with the Herodotian account of the treason of Harpagus, suggesting that the Greek tradition, for all its legendary embellishments, is grounded in a core of historical reality. The fall of Astyages was brought about by an internal betrayal, a defection of a significant portion of the Median forces to the Persian side. The third significant body of evidence, which is both tantalizing and deeply ambiguous, comes from the later Persian cultural and epic tradition, particularly the monumental poetic epic, the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi, composed in the 10th century AD. The Shahnameh does not contain the story of Astyages and Cyrus in their historical names. The Median king is not a figure in the Persian epic. However, the epic does recount the history of the Kayanian dynasty, a mythologized lineage of Iranian kings that scholars believe conflates and blurs the historical memories of the Achaemenids and the Medes. In the Shahnameh, the theme of a tyrannical king who is warned by his court astrologers of the birth of a child who will overthrow him, the attempt to kill the child's survival, and his eventual rise to power is present in multiple episodes, notably in the story of the wicked king Zahak and the hero Feridun. These stories are not direct retellings of the Astyages narrative, but they demonstrate that the archetypal pattern of the overthrown tyrant and the miraculously preserved hero was a deep and enduring component of the Iranian cultural memory, a collective recollection of a dynastic transition that was so cataclysmic and so formative that it was woven into the very fabric of the national mythology. The shadow of the Astyages legend, in this sense, is not a mere Greek invention but a mythologized reflection of a real and traumatic political rupture that was preserved, in transmuted form, in the oral traditions of the Iranian people for over 1,000 years. The critical synthesis of all these disparate sources, the richly detailed but legendary Greek account, the terse but reliable Babylonian chronicle, and the mythologized Persian epic tradition, allows the modern historian to reconstruct the probable outline of the historical events with a reasonable degree of confidence. Astyages was a historical Median king, the last of his dynasty, who ruled a large and powerful empire from his capital at Ecbatana. He faced a major rebellion from his Persian vassal, Cyrus of Anshan, a rebellion that was likely fueled by internal discontent within the Median court and nobility, a discontent that may have been exacerbated by the king's own harsh or capricious rule. A critical, decisive portion of the Median army, under the influence of a disaffected noble or nobles, defected during the climactic battle, leading to the defeat and capture of Astyages and the collapse of the Median Empire. The specific, gory details of the dreams, the infant exposure, and the cannibalistic banquet may be narrative embellishments, but they brilliantly encapsulate the underlying, essential truths of the conflict: the fear of a dynastic challenge, the arbitrary cruelty of a tyrant, and the devastating, self-destructive power of revenge. The story of Astyages, in its essence, is not merely a bedtime story for children. It is a profound, psychologically acute political fable about the fall of a king who tried to murder destiny and was, instead, devoured by it. The enduring power of the Astyages legend lies not in its literal, factual accuracy but in its profound psychological and political insight, its masterful use of narrative to explore the timeless themes of tyranny, fate, and the unintended consequences of human cruelty. The figure of Astyages, as rendered by Herodotus, is a complex, tragic character, a man who is not simply a two-dimensional monster, but a deeply flawed human being whose mind is gradually consumed by the corrosive acid of paranoia. His initial dream, and his decision to neutralize the threat through the socially demeaning marriage of Mandane, reveals a calculating, manipulative intelligence, a belief that he can outsmart the decrees of the gods through a clever political maneuver. His second dream, and his brutal command to kill the infant Cyrus, shows the rapid descent into a tyrannical logic where the life of a family member is a cheap price to pay for the preservation of power. His horrific revenge on Harpagus, the Thyestean Banquet, is the ultimate expression of a despot whose sense of inviolable authority has been challenged and who can conceive of no response other than an act of annihilating, theatrical cruelty. The story is a chilling, step-by-step chronicle of how absolute power, combined with the terror of losing that power, can warp a human soul and drive a ruler to commit acts of such profound inhumanity that they inevitably and ironically create the very rebellion they were intended to prevent. Astyages, in his desperate, monstrous attempt to kill the prophecy, becomes the essential midwife of its fulfillment, a perfect illustration of the ancient Greek concept of a divinely orchestrated fate that uses the very resistance of the doomed to bring about their downfall. The dream of the river of blood was not a deception. It was a dark, inescapable truth, and the king who tried to dam the river was, in the end, swept away by its irresistible, bloody tide. The psychological portrait of Astyages that emerges from the ancient sources, particularly from the detailed, dramatic narrative of Herodotus, is one of the most complex, chilling, and profoundly instructive character studies in all of ancient historiography, a timeless depiction of the corrupting, isolating, and ultimately self-destructive nature of paranoid tyranny. The Astyages who comes down to us is not the stereotypical, one-dimensional evil despot of cheap melodrama. He is a human being, a king who inherited a vast, powerful, and secure empire from his brilliant father Cyaxares, and who, in the first years of his reign, likely governed with the same competent, if autocratic, authority that was the norm for Near Eastern monarchs. The seeds of his destruction were not planted by an invading foreign army or by a sudden economic collapse. They were planted in the dark, fertile soil of his own subconscious, in the terrifying images of a dream that he could not dismiss or forget. The dream of the flood of urine, and its interpretation by the Magi, introduced a lethal, corrosive element into the king's psyche, the fear of a future that he could not control, the terror that his own lineage, his own daughter, would become the vessel of his displacement. This initial fear, which might have been managed or rationalized by a more psychologically resilient ruler, instead began to fester and grow, and it transformed the subsequent years of his reign into a slow, agonizing descent into a state of permanent, pathological anxiety. The crucial, irreversible turning point in the psychological disintegration of Astyages was, without any doubt, the Thyestean banquet, the gruesome feast at which he forced Harpagus to consume the flesh of his own son. This act, which is often cited as the ultimate example of ancient Near Eastern cruelty, was not merely a punishment. It was a profoundly pathological expression of the king's mental state, a window into a soul that had become so warped by absolute power and paranoid fear that the normal, universal human emotions of empathy, compassion, and familial affection had been completely extinguished. The decision to punish Harpagus in this manner, rather than through a simple, swift, and politically conventional execution, reveals a mind that was no longer operating according to the rational calculus of statecraft, but was driven by a deeper, more visceral, and more sadistic need. Astyages did not simply want to eliminate a disobedient servant. He wanted to annihilate his soul. He wanted to inflict a wound that would never heal, to demonstrate, in the most graphic and unforgettable terms imaginable, the absolute, godlike power of the king to not only take a life but to desecrate the deepest bonds of human existence. The feast was a performance, a theater of absolute power, and the audience was not merely the horrified Harpagus but the entire Median court, who were being sent an unmistakable message: resistance or disobedience of any kind, even a disobedience motivated by compassion, would be punished with a cruelty that transcended death and entered the realm of the eternally, spiritually monstrous. The tragedy of the situation, from the perspective of any rational political analysis, is that the feast of Harpagus was not only an act of profound, unforgivable evil, it was also an act of staggering political stupidity, a catastrophic strategic blunder that directly and inevitably caused the destruction of the dynasty it was intended to protect. The punishment of Harpagus did not eliminate a threat, it created the threat. A simple execution would have silenced Harpagus and removed a potentially disloyal noble from the political chessboard, a ruthless but effective method of managing internal dissent. The monstrous, theatrical punishment that Astyages chose instead did not remove Harpagus from the board. It left him alive, in a position of immense military power and influence, seething with a hatred that was so deep, so pure, and so patient that it would wait for over a decade to find its perfect, devastating expression. Astyages, in his paranoid, sadistic fury, had underestimated the resilience of the human spirit and the terrifying power of a grief that has been denied any form of healthy expression. He had turned a potentially disloyal general into an implacably, eternally devoted enemy, and he had done so in a manner that ensured that every other noble in his court, while outwardly bowing in terrified obedience, would inwardly recoil in horror and begin to quietly calculate the benefits of an alternative regime. The banquet of Harpagus, far from being a demonstration of strength, was the ultimate sign of weakness, the desperate, flailing act of a king who had lost the capacity to command genuine loyalty and could only inspire abject terror, a terror that inevitably curdled into silent, vigilant, and patiently waiting hatred. The figure of Harpagus, as the counterpoint to Astyages in this dark psychological drama, is equally fascinating and complex, a study in the devastating power of suppressed grief and the cold, calculating patience of a man who has been robbed of his humanity, and who dedicates his entire remaining existence to a single, all-consuming objective. Harpagus, after the feast, did not commit suicide, although the psychological pressure to do so must have been overwhelming. He did not flee the court, for that would have meant the immediate and torturous execution of his entire surviving family. He chose, instead, a path of absolute, inhuman self-control, a discipline so profound that he was able to mask the boiling cauldron of his hatred beneath a facade of calm, loyal, and even obsequious service for year after agonizing year. Harpagus, in the years between the feast and the rebellion of Cyrus, became a phantom, a living ghost in the court of Ecbatana, a man whose eyes, if one looked closely enough, revealed the chilling, endless void where a soul had once resided. He became the secret, silent mastermind of the conspiracy, carefully, patiently, and methodically cultivating the ambitions of the young Cyrus, whispering the poison of sedition into the ears of disaffected nobles, and waiting for the precise, perfect moment when his betrayal would be most catastrophic. The revenge of Harpagus, when it finally came on the battlefield of Pasargadae, was not the hot, impulsive vengeance of a wounded animal. It was the cold, calculated, and utterly devastating revenge of a man who had been transformed by the cruelty of his king into the perfect, patient instrument of the king's destruction. The ultimate psychological and political lesson of the Astyages narrative, a lesson that transcends its ancient Near Eastern context and speaks with a chilling relevance to any age of tyranny, is the inescapable, self-destructive logic of a regime that is founded on terror and personal cruelty rather than on legitimacy and consent. Astyages, in his attempt to secure his throne by annihilating a prophesied infant, violated the most fundamental laws of kinship and humanity, and this initial act of evil set in motion a chain of consequences that he was powerless to control. His cruelty created Harpagus, the instrument of his downfall. His paranoia alienated the Median nobility, who might otherwise have remained loyal. His attempt to murder the prophecy ensured that Cyrus would be raised in obscurity, outside the enervating, corrupting atmosphere of the court, and that he would emerge as a strong, charismatic, and divinely favored leader around whom the opposition could coalesce. The fall of Astyages was not a random, inexplicable accident of history. It was the perfectly logical, almost mathematically inevitable, outcome of his own choices. The king who had tried to drink the blood of his enemies was, in the end, consumed by it. The dream of the river of blood was not a warning of a distant, avoidable fate. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy, a dark, inescapable destiny that the king, in his desperate, monstrous attempts to avoid it, had himself brought into being. The story of Astyages is, in its deepest essence, a terrifying and profoundly instructive meditation on the nature of power, fear, and the irreducible, unconquerable human need for justice. The court of Astyages at Ecbatana, before it was shattered by the paranoia of its king and the conspiracy of Harpagus, was one of the most magnificent, sophisticated, and culturally influential royal establishments of the ancient world, a glittering, cosmopolitan center that set the standard for what an imperial Iranian court should be and which would serve as the direct model for the even more splendid Achaemenid courts of Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes. The Greek writers, who were perpetually fascinated by the immense wealth and the elaborate, rigid protocol of the Persian monarchy, traced many of the most distinctive features of the Achaemenid court directly back to their Median predecessors. The concept of a remote, semi-divine monarch, who rarely appeared in public and who communicated with his subjects through a complex hierarchy of chamberlains, messengers, and court officials, was a Median innovation that was designed to elevate the person of the king above the common sphere of humanity and to invest him with an aura of sacred, unapproachable majesty. The practice of proskynesis, the ritual bow or prostration that all who approached the king were required to perform, was a Median tradition, a physical symbol of the absolute, hierarchical chasm that separated the divine person of the Shahanshah from even his most powerful and noble subjects. The magnificent, long, flowing robes, the intricate jewelry, the richly adorned headdresses, and the general opulence of the royal attire, which are so vividly depicted in the sculpted reliefs of Persepolis, were all inherited, in their essential form, from the Median court of Ecbatana. The administrative machinery that supported this magnificent court and that governed the vast, diverse territories of the Median Empire was a sophisticated, if still somewhat feudal, apparatus that was the direct precursor to the more systematized Achaemenid satrapy system. The Median king ruled through a network of powerful, semi-autonomous vassal kings, tribal chieftains, and local dynasts, who were bound to the throne by personal oaths of loyalty, by the regular payment of tribute in silver, horses, and military manpower, and by a complex web of dynastic marriages that interlinked the Median royal house with the noble families of the subject peoples. The Persians, under their Achaemenid kings, were one of these vassal kingdoms, a subordinate but respected partner in the imperial enterprise. The system of tribute collection, which brought a steady, massive flow of wealth into the Median treasury, was managed by a class of royal scribes and administrators who used the Aramaic language and script for their records, a linguistic tradition that would continue into the Achaemenid period and beyond. The royal roads, which connected Ecbatana to the distant provinces and facilitated the rapid movement of armies, messengers, and trade caravans, were a Median innovation that the Persians later expanded into their famous royal road, which stretched from Susa to Sardis. The entire administrative and logistical infrastructure that made the Achaemenid world empire possible was, in its essential concept and its initial implementation, a Median creation, a legacy that the Persians inherited, refined, and deployed on a vastly larger scale. The courtly culture of the Medes, which placed a profound emphasis on feasting, hunting, and the cultivation of personal bonds between the king and his most powerful warriors, was another crucial element that was transmitted to the Persians and which became an enduring feature of Iranian royal culture. The Great Banquet, like the one that Astyages used as the setting for his horrific revenge, was not merely a social occasion. It was a central ritual of the Median state, a carefully orchestrated event where the king displayed his immense wealth, his generosity, and his absolute power, and where the bonds of loyalty between the ruler and his nobles were publicly and lavishly reaffirmed. The pouring of wine, the consumption of exquisitely prepared meats, the entertainment by musicians and dancers, and the exchange of precious gifts were all part of a deeply encoded ritual of power that reinforced the social hierarchy and rewarded the faithful. The royal hunt, which was a passion of the Median kings and which was later enthusiastically adopted by the Achaemenids and the Sasanians, was another essential ritual, a demonstration of the king's physical courage, his mastery over the natural world, and his role as the protector of his people from the wild and chaotic forces that threatened the settled order. These courtly rituals, which were already fully developed in the Median period, were so deeply ingrained in the Iranian conception of kingship that they would persist, in various forms, for over 1,000 years, from the Median kings of Ecbatana to the Sasanian Shahanshahs of Ctesiphon and beyond, a testament to the profound and enduring cultural legacy of the First Iranian Empire. The role of the Magi, the Median priestly tribe, at the royal court was absolutely central to both the religious and the political life of the state, and their influence, which was already immense under Astyages, would grow even greater under the Achaemenids and their successors. The Magi were not merely the interpreters of dreams, they were the custodians of the entire, complex apparatus of Zoroastrian ritual and theology, the guardians of the sacred fire, the chanters of the sacred hymns of the Avesta, and the indispensable officiants at every significant royal ceremony, from the coronation of a new king to the sacrifice before a major military campaign. The presence of the Magi at the court provided the Median and later, the Persian kings with a powerful source of religious legitimacy, a direct, institutional connection to the divine order of Ahura Mazda that elevated the monarchy above the merely human realm of political competition. The story of Astyages and his dreams, in which the Magi play such a crucial and dramatic role, is itself a vivid illustration of their immense power and their intimate access to the king. Their ability to interpret the dream, to shape the king's understanding of the divine will, gave them a political influence that was both respected and feared. The fact that Cyrus, when he overthrew Astyages, immediately co-opted and patronized the Magi, elevating them to the official priesthood of his new empire, is a clear indication of their indispensable political utility and their deep-rooted cultural authority. The Median Magi, the wise men of the East, who would later be immortalized in the Gospel of Matthew, were one of the most significant and enduring cultural legacies of the Median Empire, a priestly tradition that would shape the religious landscape of Iran and the wider world for millennia. The material splendor of the Median court, the accumulated wealth of generations of conquest and tribute, was legendary in the ancient world, and the descriptions in the Greek sources, while no doubt exaggerated, conveyed the sense of awe and wonder that the magnificent capital of Ecbatana inspired in foreign visitors. The 7 concentric walls of the city, each one higher than the one before it and each one painted in a different brilliant color, white, black, scarlet, blue, orange, silver, and gold, were, according to Herodotus, a deliberate representation of the celestial bodies, a microcosm of the cosmos with the king, in his golden inner sanctum, occupying the divine center. The royal treasury, which was filled with the tribute of the subject nations, contained an unimaginable quantity of precious metals, rare textiles, exotic woods, and beautifully crafted works of art, a concentration of wealth that had been amassed over the course of the Median century. When Cyrus the Great conquered Ecbatana, the seizure of this immense treasure was a transformative event for the fledgling Persian Empire, providing the financial resources that would fund the subsequent decades of world conquest. The Median capital, with its magnificent palaces, its legendary walls, and its overflowing treasury, was the physical, tangible symbol of the empire that Astyages had inherited and which he, through his own cruelty and folly, had lost. The shadow of that lost splendor, the memory of the golden age of Median power, would linger in the Iranian imagination for centuries, a poignant reminder of the heights from which the first Iranian empire had fallen and the foundations upon which the even greater Persian Empire was built. The transmission of the Astyages legend from the oral traditions of the Iranian and Greek worlds into the written historical record, and its subsequent evolution and interpretation across the millennia, is a fascinating case study in the formation of historical memory, the interplay of myth and fact, and the enduring power of a compelling story to shape the perception of entire civilizations. The primary, and in many ways the only fully developed, literary source for the legend is Herodotus, who, as we have seen, was writing approximately a century after the events and who was dependent on the oral accounts that had been transmitted and inevitably transformed across several generations of retelling. The identity of Herodotus's informants is a matter of considerable scholarly speculation. They were likely a combination of Persian nobles who had settled in the Greek cities of Asia Minor, Median elders who preserved the traditions of their fallen empire, and the ubiquitous professional storytellers and guides who entertained and educated travelers along the great royal roads of the empire. These oral traditions were not static, faithful recordings of past events. They were living, evolving narratives that were constantly being adapted to suit the interests, the prejudices, and the dramatic sensibilities of the tellers and the audiences. The story of Astyages and Cyrus, with its powerful, universal themes of tyranny, prophecy, and the fall of the mighty, was ideally suited to this process of oral transmission and embellishment, and it is entirely likely that the version that Herodotus heard and recorded was a highly polished, dramatically structured, and morally pointed version of a much messier and more ambiguous historical reality. The subsequent Greek and Roman historical traditions, which were heavily influenced by Herodotus, largely accepted and perpetuated the central elements of his narrative, although with some notable variations and embellishments. Astyages of Cnidus, a Greek physician who served at the court of Artaxerxes II of Persia in the late 5th and early 4th centuries BC, wrote a history of Persia, the Persica, which has survived only in fragments and summaries. Astyages' account of the fall of Astyages, while agreeing that Cyrus was the grandson of the Median king, differs significantly from Herodotus in many of the details, and Astyages explicitly criticizes Herodotus as a liar, although modern scholarship generally considers Astyages' own account to be even less reliable and more filled with romantic, novelistic inventions. The Roman historian Justin, who wrote an epitome of the much earlier, lost work of Pompeius Trogus, provides yet another variation, in which Cyrus is not the grandson but a commoner, a man of humble origins who rises through the ranks of the Median army to overthrow the tyrannical king. These variations in the classical tradition demonstrate that the story of the Median fall was a fluid, contested, and constantly retold narrative, and that there was no single, authoritative version that was universally accepted even in antiquity. The very malleability of the legend, however, testifies to its profound cultural importance. The fall of the Median Empire and the rise of Cyrus were events of such seismic significance that every generation, and every historian, felt the need to retell and reinterpret the story in their own terms. The modern critical scholarship on the Astyages legend, which began in the 19th century and has continued to the present day, has moved through several distinct phases, reflecting the evolving methodologies and the broader intellectual trends in the field of ancient history. The early, naive phase of scholarship tended to accept the Herodotian narrative at face value, treating it as a straightforward, factual account of historical events, albeit with some colorful, exotic details. This approach was gradually replaced by a more critical, skeptical school of thought, particularly in the early and mid-20th century, which argued that the entire Herodotian narrative of the Median Empire was essentially a Greek fiction, a historical novel, invented to fill the gap between the fall of Assyria and the rise of Persia, and that the Medes were never a powerful, centralized state but merely a loose tribal confederation. This hyper-skeptical position, however, has been increasingly rejected in recent decades, as the archaeological evidence from sites like Tepe-Nush-i-Jan and Göbekli Tepe has confirmed the existence of a sophisticated, centralized Median culture, and as a more nuanced reading of the Babylonian Chronicle has validated the essential historical framework of a Median empire that was conquered by Cyrus. The current scholarly consensus tends toward a middle ground, recognizing that the Herodotian narrative contains a substantial core of authentic historical tradition, the existence of Astyages, the revolt of Cyrus, the defection of a portion of the Median army, but that this core has been significantly shaped, embellished, and mythologized through the processes of oral transmission and the literary artistry of Herodotus himself. The enduring, and indeed increasing, fascination with the legend of Astyages in the modern world can be attributed, in large part, to its profound psychological and political resonance, its timeless exploration of themes that are as relevant today as they were 2,500 years ago. The story of a powerful ruler who is haunted by a prophetic nightmare, who is driven by his paranoid fear to commit an escalating series of horrific atrocities, and who, in the process, creates the very instrument of his own downfall, is not merely an ancient curiosity, it is a universal, archetypal tragedy that has been reenacted, in various forms, throughout human history. The figure of Astyages, the tyrant who feeds a man his own son, has become a byword for the corrosive, self-destructive nature of absolute power, a chilling illustration of the psychological mechanisms by which a human being, isolated by the walls of his palace and the sycophantic obedience of his court, can lose all touch with ordinary human morality and can commit acts of unimaginable cruelty with a clear, self-justifying conscience. The story is a potent, ancient warning against the dangers of unchecked autocracy, a warning that has lost none of its urgency in the intervening millennia. The dream of the river of blood, which began as a private, nocturnal terror in the bedchamber of a Median king, has flowed, through the channels of historical memory, into the broad, deep river of world culture, becoming an immortal symbol of the inescapable, self-destructive logic of tyranny. The ultimate legacy of the Astyages narrative, from the perspective of the historian and the student of human nature, is its capacity to illuminate the deep, complex, and often paradoxical processes by which real historical events are transformed, over time, into powerful, culturally constitutive legends. The historical Astyages, the last king of the Medes, was likely a far more ordinary and less dramatically monstrous figure than the character who appears in Herodotus, a ruler whose downfall was probably due to a complex combination of structural political weaknesses, economic pressures, and the military genius of Cyrus, rather than solely to his own, personally orchestrated cruelty. But the legend of Astyages, the story of the dreams, the exposed infant, the cannibal feast, and the catastrophic betrayal, has, in a profound sense, superseded the historical reality, becoming the definitive, culturally authoritative account of the Median fall. This is not because the legend is literally true, but because it conveys a deeper, poetic, and moral truth about the nature of power, the psychology of tyranny, and the ultimate, inescapable triumph of justice over oppression. The dream of the river of blood is a myth, but it is a myth that tells a profound truth, a truth that has resonated across the centuries and that continues to speak to us, with undiminished power, in the present age. The story of Astyages is not merely a record of a past event, it is a living, breathing narrative that has become part of the permanent, shared heritage of human civilization. The immediate aftermath of the fall of Astyages and the integration of the Median Empire into the new Achaemenid order was a period of remarkably swift and effective consolidation, a testament to the political genius of Cyrus and to the deep, underlying cultural and ethnic affinities between the Medes and the Persians. The transition was not, as we have emphasized, a violent conquest of an alien people but a dynastic coup within the Iranian elite, and the new regime moved with impressive speed to ensure that the administrative, military, and economic structures of the former Median Empire continued to function with minimal disruption. The Median nobility, with the exception of a few irreconcilably loyalist families who were likely executed or exiled, was overwhelmingly co-opted into the new ruling class, retaining their vast estates, their local authority, and their prestigious positions in the military and the court. The Median satrapy, which encompassed the ancient heartland of the Zagros highlands and the strategic capital of Ecbatana, was established as one of the most honored and important provinces of the Achaemenid Empire, paying a fixed annual tribute of 450 silver talents, a sum that reflected its immense agricultural wealth and its critical strategic location. The Persian kings, from Cyrus onward, continued to use Ecbatana as their summer capital, a practice that symbolically and practically affirmed the continuity between the Median and the Achaemenid imperial traditions and that ensured that the Median elite remained intimately connected to the central locus of power. The military dimension of the Median integration was, if anything, even more crucial and more immediately consequential than the administrative. The Median army, which had been the most formidable military force of the Near East for over a century, was not disbanded or humiliated. It was incorporated, virtually intact, into the new Achaemenid military machine, with Median generals and Median units retaining their traditional status, their distinctive equipment, and their hard-won combat experience. The Median heavy cavalry, the cataphracts of the ancient world, who were armored from head to toe and who charged with the long, devastating lance, became the elite striking arm of the Persian forces, a role they would maintain for the entire duration of the empire. The Median infantry, particularly the expert archers who had been trained in the highland traditions of the Zagros, provided the massed missile power that was the foundation of the Persian combined arms tactics. The Median military tradition, which had been forged in the crucible of the Assyrian wars and perfected under the brilliant leadership of Astyages, was not extinguished by the Persian conquest. It was elevated, expanded, and deployed on a global scale, becoming the instrument of conquest that would, within a single generation, bring Egypt, Anatolia, and the Indus Valley under the sway of the Shahanshah. The generals who led these campaigns, men like Harpagus and other Median nobles who had transferred their loyalty to Cyrus, were the living embodiments of the Perso-Median military synthesis. The cultural and ideological assimilation of the Medes into the Achaemenid system was a more gradual and subtle process, but it was no less profound in its long-term effects. The Median language, a northwestern Iranian tongue closely related to Old Persian, continued to be widely spoken in the Median heartland for centuries, and it left a significant imprint on the lexicon of Old Persian, particularly in the realms of courtly vocabulary, military terminology, and administrative nomenclature. The Median style of dress, with the distinctive round cap, the tight-fitting tunic, and the trousers that were so well suited to the equestrian life of the highlands, was adopted by the Persian elite as their formal court attire, and the depictions of Persian nobles on the walls of Persepolis almost invariably show them in Median garb. The Median magi, as we have repeatedly noted, became the official priests of the Achaemenid state, and their religious doctrines and rituals, including the centrality of the fire altar and the dualistic cosmology of Zoroastrianism, were integrated into the imperial ideology. The visual program of the Achaemenid court, which was designed to project an image of a unified, harmonious, multi-ethnic empire, consistently depicted the Medes as the honored equals of the Persians, their distinctive costumes and dignified bearing making them visually indistinguishable from their Persian partners in the shared enterprise of ruling the world. The Medes were not merely tolerated subjects, they were, in the official iconography and the practical reality of the court, the co-rulers of the empire. The long-term consequences of this deep, structural integration were that the distinct, separate identity of the Medes, as an independent ethnic and political entity, slowly, over the course of the Achaemenid period and the subsequent centuries, began to blur and dissolve into the broader, composite identity of the Iranian people. The Medes, who had been the founders of the First Iranian Empire and the senior partners in the initial phase of the Achaemenid state, gradually became simply one of the many Iranian tribes that made up the population of the empire, their specific historical memories and their distinct cultural traits merging with those of the Persians, the Bactrians, the Parthians. and the other Iranian peoples who inhabited the vast territory from the Zagros to the Hindu Kush. The name, Mede itself, however, never entirely disappeared. It continued to be used, particularly in the Greek and Roman sources, as a general term for the Iranian peoples, and the region of Media, the ancient heartland around Ecbatana, retained its name through the Seleucid, Parthian, and Sasanian periods and into the Islamic era, where it became the province of Al-Jibal, the mountains, and eventually the modern Iranian province of Hamadan. The shadow of the Medes, in this deep, geographical sense, was permanently and indelibly imprinted on the map of the world, a silent, enduring testament to the power and the importance of the first Iranian empire, the empire that had destroyed Assyria, humbled Lydia, and laid the essential foundations for the glory of Cyrus the Great. The dream of Astyages, the nightmare that had set all of these world-changing events in motion, had, in its own dark and twisted way, become a self-fulfilling prophecy, a vision of a flood that had, indeed, swept away the old world and, in its wake, had given birth to a new, magnificent, and enduring order. The comparative analysis of the Astyages legend with other prominent dynastic overthrow myths from across the ancient world reveals a common, deeply embedded narrative structure that transcends cultural boundaries and suggests a universal human preoccupation with the themes of the usurping infant, the tyrant's fear of the new generation, and the inescapable, divinely ordained cycle of the rise and fall of kings. The most striking and often cited parallel is the birth legend of Sargon of Akkad, the great Mesopotamian conqueror who founded the Akkadian Empire in the 24th century BC, over 1,000 years before the Medes. The Sargon legend, which is preserved in a Neo-Assyrian text of the 8th century BC but which certainly reflects a much older oral tradition, recounts how Sargon was born in secret, placed in a basket of reeds sealed with bitumen by his mother, and cast adrift on the Euphrates River. He was rescued by a gardener, who raised him as his own son, and through the favor of the goddess Ishtar, he rose from these humble origins to become the king of the world. The structural parallels with the Cyrus story are immediate and compelling: the hidden, dangerous birth, the exposure or abandonment of the infant, the rescue by a lowly, humble person, and the eventual, glorious rise to supreme power. This narrative pattern, which folklorists classify as the heroic biography, or the exposed child motif, is found in the myths and legends of cultures across the globe, from the Greek Oedipus to the Roman Romulus and Remus, and it seems to be a fundamental, archetypal story that expresses the mysterious, unpredictable, and often paradoxical nature of charisma and destiny. The biblical account of the birth and early life of Moses, as recorded in the book of Exodus, provides another powerful and culturally influential parallel, one that was almost certainly shaped by the same Near Eastern literary and folkloric traditions that produced the Sargon legend and the Cyrus story. Moses, born into a Hebrew family during a time of brutal oppression, is condemned to death by the decree of the Egyptian pharaoh, who, in a terror-driven decision that mirrors the actions of Astyages, orders all newborn Hebrew males to be killed. Moses' mother, to save her child, places him in a wicker basket coated with pitch and sets him adrift on the Nile River, where he is discovered by the daughter of the pharaoh herself, who rescues him and raises him as her own son in the royal court. The infant who is condemned to die is not only saved but is raised in the very household of the tyrant who sought his death, and he eventually returns to lead his people to freedom and to destroy the oppressive power of Egypt. The thematic resonance with the Cyrus legend is profound: the paranoid, murderous decree of the tyrant, the desperate maternal attempt to save the child, the ironic survival of the infant within or in close proximity to the royal sphere, and the eventual, catastrophic confrontation between the now-grown child and the oppressive, doomed king. In both stories, the attempt to annihilate the prophesied threat is the very mechanism that ensures its survival, and its ultimate, devastating triumph. The story of Oedipus, the tragic king of Thebes in Greek mythology, provides a variation on the theme that is even more psychologically complex and horrifying, a narrative in which the attempt to escape the prophecy is precisely what brings it to its gruesome, inevitable fulfillment. Oedipus's parents, King Laius and Queen Jocasta, are warned by the oracle of Apollo that their newborn son will grow up to murder his father and marry his mother. Horrified, they order a servant to take the infant to the mountains and kill him, piercing his ankles and leaving him to die of exposure. The servant, like the herdsman Mithridates in the Cyrus legend, cannot bring himself to commit the direct act of murder, and instead gives the infant to a shepherd from Corinth, who takes the child to his own childless king and queen. Oedipus is raised as a prince in Corinth, unaware of his true parentage, and when he comes of age and hears the terrible prophecy about himself, he flees Corinth in a desperate attempt to avoid his fate, a flight that brings him directly into the collision course with his real father, whom he unknowingly kills in a roadside dispute, and his real mother, whom he marries. The story of Oedipus, like the story of Astyages and Cyrus, is a chilling, masterful exploration of the paradox of prophecy. The more desperately one struggles to avoid a divinely ordained fate, the more surely and terribly one is ensnared in its inescapable web. These comparative examples, drawn from the very different cultural spheres of Mesopotamia, Israel, and Greece, serve to illuminate the fact that the narrative of Astyages and Cyrus is not a random or isolated invention but a specific, culturally localized instance of a much broader, transcultural narrative archetype. The archetype serves a profound social and psychological function. It provides a compelling, emotionally satisfying explanation for the sudden, dramatic rise of a new political order and the collapse of an old one, framing the transition not as a mere, chaotic power struggle but as a divinely willed, morally charged drama in which a cruel and unjust tyrant is overthrown by a hero who has been specially favored and preserved by the gods. The story simultaneously legitimizes the new ruler, by demonstrating his extraordinary destiny and his humble, authentic connection to the common people, and delegitimizes the old ruler, by exposing his tyranny, his cruelty, and his foolish, futile attempt to defy the divine plan. The narrative of the dream, the exposed infant, the cannibal feast, and the betrayal is not simply a history, it is a powerful, ideologically charged founding myth, a story that was told and retold, not because it was factually accurate in every detail, but because it expressed a deeper, essential, and deeply satisfying truth about the nature of legitimate power and the inevitable downfall of the tyrannical usurper. The enduring, cross-cultural appeal of this narrative archetype, and its continual reappearance in the literatures and mythologies of vastly different civilizations, is a testament to its profound psychological resonance and its capacity to address some of the most fundamental anxieties of the human condition. The fear of a new generation supplanting the old, the terror of a prophetic dream that reveals a dark, inescapable future, the desperate, horrific lengths to which a person in power will go to preserve that power, and the ultimate, comforting, and morally reassuring belief that tyranny, no matter how absolute, will eventually be overcome by a divinely ordained force of justice. These are not merely the concerns of the ancient Medes and Persians. They are universal, enduring themes that speak directly to the core of the human experience. The legend of Astyages, with its rich, vivid, and horrifying details, is one of the most powerful and artistically accomplished expressions of this universal archetype, a narrative masterpiece that has, for over 2,500 years, captivated the imagination, provoked profound moral reflection, and shaped the very way that we understand the tragic, paradoxical, and ultimately redemptive dynamics of power, fate, and history. The journey we have undertaken through the dark, labyrinthine corridors of the Astyages legend, from the terrifying nocturnal vision of a golden flood to the cold, calculated revenge of a man who was fed his own son's flesh, has revealed a story that is far more than a mere chronicle of dynastic succession. It is a profound, timeless, and deeply unsettling exploration of the psychology of tyranny, the mechanisms of fate, and the unforeseen, catastrophic consequences that flow from a single act of desperate, paranoid cruelty. We have seen how the Median Empire, which at the beginning of Astyages' reign was a seemingly unshakable edifice of power and wealth, the dominant force in the Near East, was brought to its knees and utterly destroyed not by an external invasion or by an overwhelming economic collapse, but by the internal, psychological disintegration of its own king. The dream of the vine, the vision of the flood, were not merely the random, meaningless firings of a sleeping brain. They were the catalysts that unlocked a deep, latent vein of terror and authoritarian cruelty in the soul of Astyages, a fear that drove him to attempt the murder of an infant, to orchestrate the most horrifying banquet in ancient history, and, in the process, to create the very enemies who would unite to destroy him. The fall of the Median Empire, when it finally came on the dusty plains of Pasargadae, was not a tragic, unforeseeable accident. It was the perfectly logical, almost mathematically inevitable, culmination of a chain of events that Astyages himself, in his blind, furious attempt to defy the gods, had set in motion. The profound historical irony that lies at the dark heart of this narrative is that the monstrous cruelty of Astyages, which was intended to preserve his throne for his own line, was the very instrument that delivered that throne to the grandson he had tried to kill. Every single major decision that Astyages made, from the socially demeaning marriage of Mandane to the Persian vassal, to the command to Harpagus to murder the infant Cyrus, to the horrific punishment of Harpagus after the discovery of the substitution, was a catastrophic strategic blunder that directly and inexorably advanced the prophetic destiny that he was so desperately trying to thwart. The marriage to a Persian, which was intended to degrade the status of any offspring, instead produced a son who was culturally and militarily rooted in the Persian highlands, and who could draw upon the fierce, independent warrior traditions of his father's people. The command to Harpagus, which was meant to eliminate the threat in its infancy, instead placed the infant in the hands of the one man who, through a combination of compassion and political self-preservation, would ensure the child's survival. And the Thyestean banquet, the act of unspeakable cruelty that was meant to be the ultimate demonstration of the king's absolute, godlike power, instead transformed Harpagus from a potentially disloyal general into an implacably, eternally devoted enemy who would spend a decade patiently, secretly, and brilliantly orchestrating the king's complete and total destruction. Astyages, in his desperate, paranoid struggle against the prophecy, became the prophecy's most effective and indispensable agent. The legacy of Astyages, as it has been transmitted to us through the Greek, Babylonian, and Persian traditions, is thus not the legacy of a mighty, successful, and revered monarch but the cautionary, chilling legacy of a tyrant who was destroyed by the very instruments of his own tyranny. His name has become, in the annals of world history, synonymous with the fatal, self-destructive arrogance of power, the hubris that the Greeks believed was the inevitable precursor to Nemesis, the divine retribution that falls upon those who, in their insane, inflated pride, believe themselves to be above the laws of gods and men. The image that has endured across the millennia is not the king seated in his golden palace, surrounded by the 7 walls of Ecbatana, but the king in his darkened bedchamber, waking in a cold sweat from a nightmare of a river of blood, and the king at the banquet table, his eyes glittering with a terrible, triumphant malice as he watches a father unknowingly consume the flesh of his son. These are the images that have seared themselves into the cultural memory of the West, the unforgettable, horrifying vignettes that have made the story of Astyages not merely a historical episode but a permanent, powerful, and profoundly unsettling part of the human narrative. As we conclude this first part of our exploration into the dark, prophetic world of the last Median king, we stand at the threshold of an even greater story, a story that begins where the tale of Astyages ends. The fall of the Median Empire was not a final, isolated event. It was the explosive, transformative birth of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, the world-conquering power that would, within a single generation, bring the ancient civilizations of Egypt, Babylon, Lydia, and the Indus Valley under the sway of a single, magnificent, and divinely favored king, Cyrus the Great. The grandson whom Astyages had tried to murder in his cradle, the boy who had been raised as a peasant in the wild highlands of Media, was now the master of the Iranian plateau, and his ambitions, his genius, and his destiny would soon carry him far beyond the ancient, legendary walls of Ecbatana, into the vast, glittering, and waiting world that was to be his empire. The dream of the river of blood had been fulfilled, not as a symbol of destruction but as a symbol of a new, immense, and world-altering power, a flood that would sweep across the entire continent of Asia, not to destroy, but to create a new, unprecedented order, the first true world empire in the history of human civilization. The shadow of Astyages, the tragic, terrifying, and ultimately self-destroyed king, was the dark, fertile soil from which the brilliant, golden age of the Persian Empire was destined to grow. The transformation of the raw, brutal events of the fall of Astyages into a polished, morally charged founding myth of the Achaemenid dynasty was a deliberate and brilliantly executed act of political propaganda, one that served to legitimize the new Persian order by casting Cyrus not as a foreign conqueror and usurper but as the divinely ordained restorer of justice and the rightful heir to the Median throne. A narrative that was carefully cultivated and disseminated across the vast, multi-ethnic expanse of the burgeoning empire. The story of the prophetic dream, the exposed infant, the miraculous survival, and the final, catastrophic betrayal was not merely an entertaining tale for the amusement of the court. It was a foundational charter of legitimacy, a narrative that addressed, in a compelling and emotionally satisfying manner, the deeply problematic question of how a vassal king could justifiably overthrow his sovereign and seize the imperial throne. By framing the conflict as the result of a divinely sent, inescapable fate, and by portraying Astyages as a monstrous tyrant whose cruelty had alienated the gods and forfeited his right to rule, the narrative absolved Cyrus of the taint of treason and presented his rebellion as a necessary, righteous, and divinely willed act of liberation. The Medes themselves, in this narrative, were not conquered enemies but victims of a wicked king, and their defection, orchestrated by the wronged Harpagus, was an act of justice, a restoration of the moral order that Astyages had so horribly violated. The specific elements of the Herodotian narrative were exquisitely tailored to resonate with the diverse cultural and religious sensibilities of the empire's subject populations, each motif drawing upon deep-seated, widely recognized symbols and archetypes. The dream of the flood, which recalled the Mesopotamian traditions of the Great Deluge and the destructive power of divine waters, signified an unstoppable, world-altering force, a power that could not be contained by any human agency. The image of the vine, an ancient Near Eastern symbol of royalty, life, and fertility that was carved into the reliefs of Assyrian palaces and woven into the iconography of divine kingship, proclaimed the organic, inevitable, and divinely blessed growth of Cyrus's dominion. The motif of the exposed child, a narrative pattern that was already ancient in the Near East, as evidenced by the Sargon legend, instantly elevated Cyrus to the status of a heroic figure, a man whose charisma and destiny were evident from his miraculous birth and his survival against all odds. The Thyestean Banquet, a motif of such primal horror that it would echo through Greek tragedy for centuries, served to demonize Astyages absolutely, transforming him from a legitimate, if tyrannical, ruler into a monster who had violated the most fundamental laws of hospitality, kinship, and humanity, a man whose destruction was not only politically necessary but morally imperative. This carefully constructed narrative was, in effect, a sophisticated, multi-layered instrument of soft power, a story that was designed to be told and retold in the marketplaces, the military camps, and the royal courts of the empire, gradually erasing any lingering loyalty to the old Median dynasty and replacing it with a fervent belief in the divine mandate of Cyrus. The role of the Magi within this narrative was particularly crucial and carefully calibrated, as it provided an internal, priestly validation of Cyrus's legitimacy from the very heart of the Median religious establishment. The Magi were the ones who had interpreted the dreams, who had warned Astyages of the prophecy, and who, after the birth of Cyrus, had advised the king that the danger was past, a misinterpretation that, in the narrative's logic, allowed Cyrus to survive and grow to manhood. By incorporating the Magi into the story as the authoritative interpreters of the divine will, the narrative implicitly argued that the Median religious authorities themselves had, albeit unknowingly, recognized and facilitated the divine plan. Furthermore, the historical co-optation of the Magi by Cyrus, their elevation to the position of official priests of the Achaemenid state, was retroactively legitimized by this narrative. It was not a cynical political maneuver but the natural, divinely ordained consequence of their role in the unfolding of the sacred prophecy. The Magi, who had served the Median tyrant, were now, by the logic of the story, restored to their proper, honored place as the servants of the true, divinely chosen king, a narrative that allowed the powerful Median priestly class to accept Persian rule without a loss of prestige or religious authority. The story, therefore, was not just a piece of Persian propaganda but a negotiated, consensual foundation myth that served the interests of both the new Persian ruling house and the old Median religious and military elite. The transmission of this founding myth throughout the empire was facilitated by the very administrative and communicative infrastructure that the Medes had pioneered and the Persians had perfected, ensuring that the authorized version of the dynastic transition reached every corner of the vast imperial territory. The royal roads, with their network of posting stations and mounted couriers, allowed the swift dissemination of official proclamations and decrees, which could be inscribed on stone and erected in prominent public spaces, as Darius the Great would later do with the Behistun inscription. The royal court itself, with its constant flow of satraps, vassal kings, and foreign ambassadors, was a powerful engine of narrative dissemination, as the official story was performed and reinforced through ceremonial rituals, courtly discourse, and the display of symbolic art. The sculpted reliefs at Persepolis, which depicted the Medes and Persians as equal partners in the imperial enterprise, were a permanent, visual affirmation of the narrative of harmonious union, a daily, visible reminder to the court and to visiting dignitaries that the old enmity had been replaced by a new, divinely sanctioned order. The story of Astyages and Cyrus, in its many oral and written forms, became the authorized, official memory of the empire's birth, a narrative that was taught to the children of the elite, recounted by the professional storytellers who traveled the royal roads, and eventually recorded by the Greek historians who visited the empire, ensuring its survival into the modern era. The enduring power of this foundation myth is evident in the fact that, even after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire to Alexander the Great, the core elements of the Astyages-Cyrus narrative continued to be told and retold, adapted and reinterpreted, by successive generations of Greeks, Romans, and in mythologized form, by the Iranians themselves. The story had become detached from its immediate political context and had entered the universal treasury of human narratives, a timeless tale of tyranny, prophecy, and the rise of a hero that could be applied to any age and any political circumstance. The dream of the river of blood, the exposed infant, and the cannibal feast became archetypal images, powerful cultural symbols that could be invoked to illustrate the dangers of hubris, the inescapable nature of fate, and the ultimate triumph of justice over cruelty. The legend, which had been carefully crafted by the Achaemenid court to legitimize a specific dynastic transition, had achieved a far greater and more enduring success. It had become an immortal story, a permanent part of the shared heritage of human civilization. A narrative that continues to resonate with profound psychological and political truth thousands of years after the last Median king drew his final breath in the golden palace of Ecbatana. The reception and reinterpretation of the Astyages legend in the broader Greek literary and philosophical tradition beyond the foundational account of Herodotus reveals a fascinating process of cultural appropriation and adaptation, as the story was gradually detached from its specific Iranian context and transformed into a universal parable about the nature of power, fate, and the human condition. The historian Astyages of Cnidus, who, as we have noted, served as a physician at the Achaemenid court in the early 4th century BC and who had direct access to Persian oral traditions, composed a rival account of the fall of Astyages in his Persica, a work that has survived only in the fragments and summaries preserved by later authors such as the patriarch Photius. Astyages' version, while agreeing with Herodotus on the essential point that Cyrus was the instrument of Astyages' downfall, diverges dramatically in almost every other detail, a divergence that reveals the fluid and contested nature of the oral traditions that circulated within the empire itself. In Astyages, Cyrus is not the grandson of Astyages but the son of a Persian bandit and a goatherd, a man of utterly humble origins who rises through the ranks of the Median court by his own cunning and ability, a classic rags to riches narrative that appealed to a different set of cultural expectations. The specific, gory details of the Herodotian account, the dreams and the cannibal feast, are absent from Astyages' version, replaced by a more straightforward, novelistic tale of court intrigue and military prowess, a reminder that the story we know from Herodotus was only one of many competing versions that were in circulation. The philosophical tradition of ancient Greece also found in the story of Astyages and his prophetic dreams a rich source of material for reflection on the relationship between divine foreknowledge, human free will, and the moral responsibility of the individual. The question at the heart of the legend is whether Astyages was a tragic victim of an inescapable fate, a puppet whose strings were pulled by the gods, or whether his downfall was the just and deserved consequence of his own freely chosen, monstrous actions. The narrative, as constructed by Herodotus, seems to argue for a complex, paradoxical synthesis of both positions. The dream was a genuine, divinely sent prophecy that accurately foretold the future, but it was Astyages' own, freely chosen response to that prophecy, his fear, his cruelty, his attempt to murder the infant, that directly and inevitably brought the prophecy to its fulfillment. This paradox, which lies at the very heart of Greek tragic thought, resonated deeply with the philosophical inquiries of the 5th and 4th centuries BC, as thinkers like Sophocles, in his Oedipus cycle, and the early Stoics grappled with the tension between determinism and moral accountability. The story of Astyages, as transmitted through the Greek tradition, became a powerful, concrete illustration of the philosophical principle that the attempt to evade fate is the very mechanism by which fate is realized, a theme that would echo through the tragedies of Aeschylus and the dialogues of Plato. The figure of Harpagus, the wronged courtier who patiently, silently, and devastatingly avenges the murder of his son, emerged in the later Greek and Roman traditions as a particularly compelling and morally complex character, a study in the psychology of resentment and the terrifying, implacable power of a grief that has been denied any legitimate outlet. The Harpagus of Herodotus is not a simple villain or a heroic rebel. He is a man who has been hollowed out by an unimaginable atrocity, a living ghost who dedicates every waking moment of his remaining existence to a single, all-consuming objective. His revenge, when it finally arrives, is not a hot-blooded, impulsive act of violence but a cold, meticulously planned, and utterly devastating military and political betrayal, a stroke of genius that topples an empire. The Roman writer Seneca, in his philosophical treatise on anger, would later use the story of Harpagus as a prime example of the corrosive, self-destroying nature of suppressed rage, a passion that, if not mastered, can consume the soul and lead a man to commit acts of monstrous, disproportionate destruction. The figure of Harpagus, the patient avenger, entered the gallery of classical archetypes, a dark, cautionary figure who demonstrated the profound, world-altering consequences that can flow from a single, unforgivable act of cruelty. The historical memory of Astyages himself, as preserved in the Greek tradition, underwent a gradual process of simplification and demonization, as the complex, psychologically nuanced portrait of Herodotus was reduced, in many later accounts, to a two-dimensional stereotype of the archetypal Oriental despot. The historian and essayist Plutarch, writing in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, mentions Astyages in his Life of Alexander and other works primarily as a foil to the more glamorous figures of Cyrus and the Achaemenid kings, a symbol of the effete, decadent, and ultimately doomed monarchy that the virile, dynamic Persian power had supplanted. The magnificence of Ecbatana, the legendary 7 walls, the vast treasures, all became, in this simplified moral narrative, signs not of power but of softness, luxury, and corruption, the inevitable symptoms of a regime that had lost its martial vigor and its moral compass. This process of stereotyping, which was part of the broader Greek construction of the barbarian, as the antithesis of Greek virtue, stripped the figure of Astyages of much of his tragic complexity and transformed him into a useful, one-dimensional example of the dangers of Eastern despotism. The dream of the river of blood, in this simplified tradition, became merely the ominous prelude to a well-deserved fall, a dramatic device that signaled the moral decay of the Median court and the divinely ordained triumph of the superior Persian, and by extension, Greek, civilization. Despite these transformations and simplifications, the core elements of the Astyages legend, as first recorded by Herodotus, proved to be remarkably durable, surviving the decline of classical civilization and the rise of Christianity to re-emerge, in new and often surprising forms, in the literature and art of the medieval and Renaissance periods. The story was preserved, in fragmentary form, through the works of the late antique chroniclers and historians, such as Orosius and Eusebius, who incorporated elements of the classical narrative into their universal histories, thereby transmitting it to the scholarly monks and chroniclers of the Middle Ages. The Renaissance, with its passionate rediscovery of classical texts and its fascination with the political and moral lessons of ancient history, witnessed a renewed interest in the figures of Astyages and Cyrus, who were frequently used as moral examples, in the educational literature and political treatises of the period. The Italian political philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli, in his Prince, would famously cite Cyrus as a model of the virtuous, successful founder of a new state, a man who rose to power through his own ability and the favor of fortune, an interpretation that, while largely ignoring the gory details of the Astyages legend, was deeply indebted to the classical tradition that had preserved the memory of the Persian founder's extraordinary ascent from the ashes of the Median Empire. The survival and transformation of the Astyages legend within the Persian and broader Iranian cultural tradition is a story of remarkable adaptation, as the specific, historical details of the last Median king's reign were gradually absorbed, mythologized, and ultimately replaced by the grand, sweeping narratives of the Achaemenid dynasty that dominate the epic poetry of the Shahnameh. The Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, completed by the poet Ferdowsi around 1010 AD, is the monumental repository of Iranian national mythology, a vast epic that recounts the history of the Iranian people from the creation of the world to the Arab conquest in the 7th century AD. The historical Astyages, the king who was defeated by Cyrus the Great, does not appear in the Shahnameh under his own name. Instead, the memory of the Median Empire and its tumultuous end was merged, along with the Achaemenid and other pre-Islamic Iranian dynasties, into the legendary Achaemenid cycle, a line of kings that includes figures such as Kai Khosrow, Kai Kavas, and the great hero Rostam. The specific narrative of the prophetic dream, the exposed infant, and the cannibal feast was not directly transmitted into the Persian epic tradition, but the underlying, essential archetypes that drive the story, the fear of a prophesied usurper, the attempt to murder a royal infant, the survival and eventual triumph of the child, and the catastrophic downfall of a proud and mighty king, are deeply woven into the fabric of the Shahnameh in multiple, transformative variations. The figure of the tyrant King Zahak, one of the most memorable and horrifying villains of the Shahnameh, embodies many of the thematic concerns that are present in the Astyages legend, albeit in a vastly more mythologized and demonic form. Zahak, a prince who is seduced by the evil spirit Ahriman, becomes a monstrous serpent king with serpents growing from his shoulders that must be fed daily with the brains of young men. A prophetic dream warns Zahak that a young hero named Feridun will one day overthrow him, and the terrified king launches a frantic, empire-wide search to find and kill the infant Feridun, a clear parallel to the actions of Astyages. The hero Feridun, like Cyrus, survives the king's murderous campaign through a combination of divine protection, the intervention of compassionate individuals, and his own extraordinary destiny, and he eventually rises to lead a rebellion that defeats and imprisons the monstrous tyrant, liberating the world from his reign of terror. The story of Zahak and Feridun, while not a direct retelling of the Astyages-Cyrus narrative, is a profound and powerful reimagining of the same deep, archetypal patterns: the tyrant who is warned of his downfall, the attempt to kill the prophesied child, the miraculous survival of the hero, and the final, divinely willed triumph of justice over monstrous oppression. The shadow of Astyages, in this sense, is absorbed into the far larger and more terrifying shadow of Zahak, a mythic tyrant whose evil surpasses even the horrors of the Thyestean Banquet. The figure of the Magi, who played such a crucial role in the Herodotian account of Astyages' dreams, also underwent a significant transformation in the later Iranian tradition, becoming the revered guardians of the Zoroastrian faith and the custodians of the sacred fire, their historical connection to the Median court, and their role in the interpretation of the fateful dreams gradually fading into the background. In the Shahnameh and the Zoroastrian religious texts, the Magi, or Magian, are portrayed as the wise, learned, and pious priestly class, the keepers of the ancient wisdom, and the essential officiants at all royal and religious ceremonies. Their role as the interpreters of dreams, which was so central to the Astyages narrative, became generalized into a broader function of mediating between the divine and human realms, performing rituals, and advising kings on spiritual matters. The specific memory of the Magi's involvement in the fall of Astyages was likely suppressed or forgotten, as it did not accord with the elevated, sacred status that the priestly class had acquired in the Sasanian period and after. The Magi, who had been the trusted but ultimately fallible advisors of the last Median king, were transformed into the infallible, holy custodians of the true religion, a classic example of how the institutional memory of a powerful social group can reshape and sanitize its own historical role in the transmission of the national narrative. The name of Cyrus, the great conqueror and founder of the Achaemenid Empire, was also subsumed into the Chionian cycle, where he is generally identified with the legendary King Kai Khosrow, a figure of immense wisdom, justice, and military prowess, who avenges the death of his father and establishes a reign of peace and prosperity. The Shahnameh does not recount the story of a Persian vassal rebelling against his Median grandfather. Instead, it tells of Kai Khosrow's heroic campaigns against the Turanians, the mythic enemies of Iran, and his ultimate, mystical withdrawal from the world, a narrative that bears little superficial resemblance to the historical events of the 6th century BC. The absorption of the historical Cyrus into the mythical Kai Khosrow, and the parallel absorption of the historical Astyages into the mythical Zahak and other tyrant figures, represents the final, complete mythologization of the Median-Persian transition, a process by which the messy, complex, and morally ambiguous historical events were transformed into the clean, heroic, and morally unambiguous narratives of the national epic. The dream of the river of blood, which had once been a specific, personal nightmare of a real, historical king, had, in the deep currents of Iranian cultural memory, become a universal symbol of the inevitable fall of the tyrannical and the unjust, a theme that could be endlessly reworked and reapplied to new historical and mythical contexts. The remarkable resilience of the core narrative archetypes in the Iranian tradition, despite the loss of the specific historical names and details, is a powerful testament to the deep, enduring cultural and psychological function that these stories serve. The fall of the Median Empire, the first great Iranian imperial state, was a cataclysmic event of such profound significance that its memory could not be simply forgotten. It had to be processed, interpreted, and integrated into the collective identity of the Iranian people. The mythologization of that traumatic transition, the transformation of Astyages into a demonic tyrant and Cyrus into a divinely blessed hero, was a necessary and creative act of cultural healing, a way of explaining the inexplicable and of making a painful, chaotic past serve the needs of a glorious, unified present. The dream of the river of blood, in its endless mythic refractions, became a permanent part of the Iranian spiritual and poetic imagination, a dark, fertile seed from which countless stories of tyranny, prophecy, and liberation would continue to grow and flourish for over 1,000 years, from the epic verses of Ferdowsi to the mystical poetry of Rumi. The role of the Magi in the Astyages legend, and more broadly in the religious and political culture of the Medes and Persians, provides a unique window into the intricate, often tense, relationship between the royal authority and the priestly class in the ancient Iranian world, a relationship that was characterized by both profound mutual dependence and an underlying, persistent potential for conflict. The Magi, as we have repeatedly noted, were not simply a generic priesthood. They were a specific, hereditary Median tribe, one of the 6 that Herodotus lists as forming the core of the Median Confederation. This dual identity, as both an ethnic group and a professional religious caste, gave the Magi a unique and immensely powerful position within the Median state. They were not merely servants of the king, they were the representatives of a powerful, independent tribal constituency, and their control over the rituals of sacrifice, the interpretation of dreams, and the sacred fire temples gave them a monopoly over the means of communicating with the divine world, a monopoly that even the most powerful monarch could not afford to ignore or destroy. The story of Astyages and his dreams is, on one level, a vivid illustration of this dynamic. The king, despite his absolute temporal power, is utterly dependent on the Magi to understand the meaning of his own nightmares and to advise him on the appropriate course of action, a dependence that places the priestly class in a position of extraordinary, albeit subtle, political influence. The interpretation of dreams, or oniromancy, was one of the most important and highly developed functions of the Magi, a specialized form of knowledge that was rooted in the ancient Mesopotamian tradition of dream interpretation, which had been systematized in extensive cuneiform manuals and which was transmitted, in adapted form, to the Iranian plateau. The Magi, like their Babylonian counterparts, believed that dreams were not random neurological firings but were direct, divinely sent messages, often opaque and symbolic, that required expert interpretation to be properly understood. The dream of Astyages, with its vivid, potent imagery of the golden flood and the all-encompassing vine, was a classic example of the kind of symbolic, prophetic dream that the Magi were trained to decipher. Their ability to translate these cryptic images into a coherent political prophecy, and to predict the rise of Cyrus, was a demonstration of their specialized knowledge that simultaneously validated their own authority and served the narrative purposes of the Achaemenid dynasty. The fact that the Magi, in the Herodotian account, later changed their interpretation, advising Astyages that the prophecy had been fulfilled by the childhood game of kings, can be read as either a genuine error, a deliberate act of political sabotage, or a later narrative device to explain why the tyrant relaxed his guard. But it undeniably underscores the Magi's pivotal role as the gatekeepers of divine knowledge and the shapers of royal policy. The relationship between the Magi and the Zoroastrian religion, which would eventually become the dominant, and later the state, religion of the Iranian empires, is a complex and much debated subject, but it is clear that the Magi were the essential agents in the transmission, systematization, and ritual elaboration of the Zoroastrian tradition. The prophet Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, whose dates and place of origin are still matters of scholarly dispute, preached a radical, dualistic theology centered on the supreme god Ahura Mazda and the cosmic struggle against the evil spirit Ngramenu, a theology that was fundamentally distinct from the traditional polytheistic religions of the ancient Near East. The Magi, who were the established priestly class of the Medes, gradually adopted and adapted Zoroastrian ideas, integrating them with their own, older traditions of fire worship, ritual sacrifice, and dream interpretation to create the complex, syncretic religious system that was the official cult of the Achaemenid court. The Achaemenid kings, while always honoring Ahura Mazda as the supreme deity, did not impose a rigid, dogmatic Zoroastrian orthodoxy. Instead, they patronized the Magi and allowed them to administer a broad, inclusive religious system that accommodated the cults of the diverse subject peoples of the empire. A pragmatic flexibility that was itself a legacy of the Median tradition of religious and cultural assimilation. The enduring power of the Magi as a social and religious institution is demonstrated by their remarkable survival through the successive political cataclysms that shattered the Median and Achaemenid empires. The conquests of Alexander the Great, the subsequent Seleucid period of Hellenization, and the long, decentralized rule of the Parthians did not destroy the Magi. They adapted, retreated to their local sanctuaries, and quietly preserved their religious traditions, their sacred fires, and their oral knowledge, waiting for the return of an Iranian imperial power that would restore them to their rightful, honored place. That restoration came with the rise of the Sasanian dynasty in the 3rd century AD, which made Zoroastrianism the official state religion and which created a powerful, hierarchically organized Zoroastrian church, with the Magi at its apex. The Sasanian high priest, the Mobedan Mobed, was a figure of immense political and religious authority, a direct successor to the Magi who had once interpreted the dreams of Astyages. The fire temples that dotted the Sasanian Empire, the sacred scriptures of the Avesta that were codified under Sasanian patronage, and the entire, elaborate apparatus of Zoroastrian law and ritual were the ultimate, magnificent fruition of a religious tradition that had been carefully, patiently nurtured by the Median Magi through centuries of political turmoil. The shadow of the Magi, which first appears in the historical record in the context of the Median court and the prophetic nightmares of its last king, thus stretches across more than 1,000 years of Iranian history, a continuous, unbroken thread of priestly authority and religious tradition that is one of the most remarkable and enduring legacies of the First Iranian Empire. The ultimate decline of the Magi and their Zoroastrian religion came only with the Arab conquest of the Sasanian Empire in the 7th century AD and the subsequent, gradual, but inexorable, Islamization of Iran. The fire temples were converted or destroyed, the sacred fires were extinguished, and the Zoroastrian community, once the dominant religious establishment of a vast empire, was reduced to a small, often persecuted minority. Yet, even in defeat, the legacy of the Magi did not entirely vanish. The Islamic civilization that arose on the ruins of the Sasanian Empire absorbed and transformed many of the intellectual, scientific, and administrative traditions of the Magian priestly class, and the figure of the Magus, the wise man of the East, continued to be a powerful and evocative symbol in Islamic philosophy, mysticism, and literature. The story of the Magi who followed a star to Bethlehem, as recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, ensured that the image of the wise, learned, and reverent Median priest would be permanently enshrined in the religious imagination of the Christian West, a final, ironic, and culturally profound transformation of the priestly caste that had once served the last king of the Medes and had interpreted his terrible, world-altering dream of the river of blood. The Thyestean Banquet, the horrifying act of cannibalistic revenge that lies at the dark, moral heart of the Astyages legend, is not an isolated, unique invention of the Greek or Persian imagination but is a particularly gruesome and artistically powerful example of a widespread, deeply rooted, and culturally significant narrative motif that appears in the myths, legends, and literatures of numerous ancient civilizations, each iteration exploring the profound and terrifying violation of the most fundamental taboos of human society. The motif of the parent who is tricked into consuming the flesh of their own child is a narrative of such primal, visceral horror that it seems to tap into the deepest wells of human fear and revulsion, and its recurring appearance across diverse cultures suggests that it addresses universal anxieties about the fragility of human identity, the violation of the sanctity of the body, and the catastrophic breakdown of the social order that is symbolized by the perversion of the sacred act of hospitality and the shared meal. The feast, in the ancient world, was a central ritual of social bonding, a ceremony of trust and reciprocity that was governed by strict, unwritten laws of hospitality. The violation of that sacred trust, the transformation of the feast from a celebration of life and community into a macabre theater of murder and cannibalism, was the ultimate act of transgression. A sign that the perpetrator had descended into a realm of inhuman, monstrous evil. The most famous and literarily influential parallel from the classical world is the Greek myth of Thyestes and Atreus, from which the very term, Thyestean Banquet, is derived, a story of intergenerational violence, betrayal, and horrific revenge that was a central part of the mythological cycle of the House of Atreus, one of the most cursed and tragic dynasties in all of Greek legend. The story, in its most common version, tells how Atreus and Thyestes, the sons of Pelops, became locked in a bitter, fratricidal struggle for the throne of Mycenae. Atreus, having gained the upper hand, discovered that his wife Arope had been seduced by his brother Thyestes. Feigning a desire for reconciliation, Atreus invited Thyestes to a grand banquet, a feast of forgiveness and reunion. Unbeknownst to Thyestes, Atreus had secretly murdered Thyestes' two young sons, boiled their flesh, and served it to their father at the banquet. When Thyestes had eaten his fill, Atreus, in a moment of theatrical, sadistic revelation that directly parallels the actions of Astyages, ordered the severed heads and hands of the children to be brought forth on a platter, revealing to his brother the true, horrific nature of the meal he had just consumed. The crime was so monstrous that, according to the myth, the sun itself turned backward in its course, horrified by the atrocity, and the curse that fell upon the house of Atreus would lead, in the next generation, to the murder of Agamemnon by his wife Clytemnestra and the subsequent matricide of Orestes, a cycle of violence that was explored in the immortal tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. The structural and thematic parallels between the myth of Atreus and Thyestes and the story of Astyages and Harpagus are so striking and so numerous that it is virtually certain that the two narratives are related, either through a common, now lost, Near Eastern source or through the direct influence of the Persian story on the development of the Greek myth. Both stories feature a powerful king who is wronged, or perceives himself to be wronged, by a close, trusted relative or courtier. Both kings respond not with a simple, straightforward execution but with an elaborate, theatrical, and psychologically annihilating revenge that involves the murder of the offender's innocent child and the secret, grisly serving of the child's flesh to the unsuspecting parent at a banquet. Both stories culminate in a dramatic, horrifying revelation, the sudden, devastating moment when the victim realizes the true nature of the feast he has consumed. And both acts of cannibalistic revenge, far from resolving the conflict, serve to deepen and perpetuate the cycle of hatred, creating an implacable, enduring enmity that will ultimately lead to the complete destruction of the perpetrator's house and dynasty. The Thyestean Banquet, whether in its Greek or its Median manifestation, is a narrative about the self-defeating, self-destroying nature of absolute cruelty, a demonstration that the most horrific act of vengeance does not eliminate an enemy but instead transforms him into an eternal, patient, and ultimately successful agent of retribution. The appearance of the Thyestean banquet motif in the Median legend of Astyages also serves a crucial, specific political function that goes beyond the universal themes of tyranny and revenge. By associating the Median king with such a monstrous, taboo-violating act, the narrative marks Astyages not merely as a political adversary but as a being who has forfeited his very humanity, a creature of such profound moral depravity that his overthrow is not only a political necessity but a sacred, purifying duty. The cannibal feast is the ultimate mark of the tyrant, the sign that the king has become a beast, a devourer of his own people, a violator of the fundamental laws of nature and kinship that separates civilized human society from the world of wild, chaotic, and predatory animals. Cyrus, by contrast, is the agent of divine order, the restorer of justice, the hero who slays the monster and re-establishes the proper, harmonious relationship between the king, the gods, and the people. The Thyestean banquet, in the Astyages narrative, is thus far more than a sensational, gruesome detail. It is the essential, ideological keystone of the entire story, the act of unforgivable evil that irrevocably delegitimizes the old regime and that justifies, in the most absolute and compelling terms, the violent transition of power to the new, divinely favored dynasty. The dream of the river of blood was the prophecy. The cannibal feast was the monstrous, unforgivable act that ensured the prophecy's fulfillment. The enduring power of the Thyestean banquet as a literary and cultural motif is evident in its continual reappearance, in various forms, throughout the subsequent history of Western literature and art, from the bloody revenge tragedies of the Elizabethan stage to the modern horror film and the psychological thriller. The image of the unsuspecting cannibal, the father who unknowingly consumes his own offspring, is an archetype of such profound and disturbing power that it has never lost its capacity to shock, to horrify, and to provoke deep, uncomfortable reflection on the nature of evil and the limits of human cruelty. Shakespeare, in his early, brutal tragedy Titus Andronicus, directly adapted the Thyestean banquet motif, having the wrong General Titus murder the sons of his enemy Tamora, the queen of the Goths, and bake them into a pie that he then serves to their mother at a final, apocalyptic banquet. The scene is a direct, conscious homage to the classical and ancient Near Eastern traditions, a Renaissance reimagining of the same primal, horrifying narrative that had been told, in different forms, in the Median court of Ecbatana and the Greek palaces of Mycenae. The story of Astyages and Harpagus, which may be one of the earliest recorded versions of this enduring motif, thus stands at the head of a long, dark, and immensely influential tradition of storytelling, a tradition that explores the most terrifying depths of human depravity and that, in doing so, illuminates the fragile, precious, and constantly threatened boundaries that separate civilization from the abyss of savage, monstrous chaos. The historiography of the Median Empire and the legend of Astyages has been, for over a century, one of the most fiercely debated and methodologically complex problems in the entire field of ancient Near Eastern studies, a scholarly battlefield where the reliability of the Greek literary tradition, the interpretation of fragmentary cuneiform sources, and the significance of the archaeological record have been continuously contested and re-evaluated. The fundamental problem, as we have repeatedly emphasized, is the absence of a substantial, internally generated Median written corpus. The Medes, unlike the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians, have left us no royal annals, no libraries of administrative tablets, no monumental inscriptions in their own language. Our entire knowledge of the Median state is mediated through the often hostile lens of Assyrian royal propaganda, the terse, laconic entries of the Babylonian chronicles, and the rich, dramatic, but demonstrably embellished and mythologized narratives of the Greek historians, most notably Herodotus. This evidentiary situation has led some scholars, particularly in the mid-20th century, to adopt a position of radical skepticism, arguing that the Median Empire, as described by Herodotus, was essentially a Greek historical fiction, a mirage conjured by the father of history to fill the narrative gap between the fall of Nineveh and the rise of Cyrus, and that the Medes were, in reality, little more than a loose, decentralized confederation of tribes without a genuine state apparatus or a centralized monarchy. This hyperskeptical position, which was most forcefully articulated by the German historian Helmuth Berve and others, was based on a careful, critical reading of the Greek sources and on the apparent absence of archaeological evidence for a Median imperial state comparable to the remains of the Assyrian or Achaemenid empires. The skeptics pointed out the folkloric, novelistic elements of the Herodotian account, such as the 7 concentric walls of Ecbatana and the story of the exposed infant, and they argued that such stories were clearly literary inventions, not reliable historical records. They noted the lack of a distinctive, widespread Median material culture, such as a characteristic pottery style or a standardized architectural form, that could be identified across the supposed territory of the empire. And they emphasized the fact that the contemporary, non-Greek sources, particularly the Babylonian chronicles, while confirming the existence of a Median king named Cyaxares and a Median army, did not provide any detailed description of a Median administrative state. The skeptics proposed an alternative model of the Median Empire, as a loose, tribal confederacy, a temporary military alliance of highland chieftains that coalesced under the pressure of the Assyrian threat, and that dissolved just as quickly after the destruction of Nineveh, never developing the permanent, bureaucratic institutions of a true state. The subsequent decades of archaeological and philological research, however, have largely undermined the foundations of the hyperskeptical position, providing a growing body of material evidence for the existence of a complex, sophisticated, and centralized Median society. The excavations at Tepe Nush Ijan, which revealed a purpose-built fire temple, a columned audience hall, and a storage fortress, all constructed according to a unified, pre-planned design, are utterly incompatible with the model of a loose, acephalous tribal society and point directly to a strong, centralized authority capable of mobilizing substantial resources for monumental construction. The discovery of the Median rock-cut tombs at Kiskapan and other sites, with their elaborate relief carvings and their clear connections to later Achaemenid royal iconography, provides further evidence of a developing royal ideology and a tradition of dynastic commemoration. The analysis of the Persepolis fortification tablets, which record the presence of Median officials, Median laborers, and Median tribute in the Achaemenid administrative system, confirms that the Medes were not merely a defeated enemy but an integral, organized component of the new Persian imperial state, a status that presupposes a pre-existing political and administrative structure. The cumulative weight of this archaeological and epigraphic evidence has led to a new scholarly consensus that, while the details of the Herodotian account must be treated with critical caution, the essential historical framework of a powerful, centralized Median kingdom that emerged in the 7th century BC under a dynasty of kings and that was conquered by Cyrus the Great in 550 BC, is fundamentally reliable. The contemporary Babylonian source, the Chronicle of Nabonidus, remains the single most important piece of independent, non-Greek evidence for the historical reality of the Median Empire and its fall. The Chronicle's entry for the year 550 BC, which records the revolt of the Median army against Astyages, the capture of the king, and the Persian conquest of Ecbatana, provides an incontrovertible, contemporaneous verification of the central events of the Herodotian narrative. The name of the king, Astyages, in Greek, is rendered as Ishtumgu, in the Babylonian cuneiform, a perfectly plausible and linguistically consistent rendering of the old Iranian name Arsti-Viga. The Chronicle's description of the revolt of the Median army, while terse, aligns precisely with the Herodotian account of the defection orchestrated by Harpagus, confirming that the fall of the Median Empire was caused by an internal betrayal rather than a purely external military conquest. The Babylonian evidence, therefore, serves as an essential anchor of historical fact, a fixed point around which the more elaborate and legendary Greek accounts can be critically evaluated. The dream of the river of blood, the exposed infant, and the cannibal feast are not mentioned in the Babylonian Chronicle, but the Chronicle's confirmation of the core political military events, the existence of Astyages, the revolt of his army, the victory of Cyrus, lends credibility to the idea that the Herodotean narrative, however embellished, is ultimately rooted in a genuine historical memory of a real and dramatic dynastic transition. The ongoing scholarly project of reconstructing the history of the Medes is thus a delicate and intellectually rigorous exercise in source criticism, a constant, careful process of weighing and balancing the different, often conflicting, lines of evidence. The Greek literary tradition, with its rich, psychologically acute narratives and its folkloric embellishments, provides a compelling and dramatically coherent story, but it cannot be accepted at face value. The Assyrian and Babylonian cuneiform sources provide a corrective, offering dry, analytic facts that confirm the broad outline of Median political history but that reveal nothing of the internal dynamics of the court or the personal motivations of the kings. The archaeological record provides a tangible, material dimension, confirming the existence of a sophisticated Median culture but offering few specific details about political events or individual personalities. The task of the historian is to synthesize these disparate and imperfect sources into a plausible, coherent, and critically responsible reconstruction, a task that requires both a rigorous methodological skepticism and a willingness to acknowledge the profound, enduring significance of the Median experiment in empire building. The shadow of the Medes, which was once dismissed as a mere Greek fiction, has been slowly, painstakingly illuminated by the combined disciplines of philology, archaeology, and critical historiography, revealing a civilization of genuine power, complexity, and lasting historical importance. The archaeological and epigraphic evidence for the reign of Astyages himself, as distinct from the broader material culture of the Median period, remains exceptionally sparse, a frustrating void that stands in stark contrast to the richly dramatic and psychologically detailed portrait that has been preserved in the Greek literary tradition. We have no monument, no inscription, no administrative tablet, and no sculpted relief that can be definitively attributed to the personal patronage or the specific reign of the last Median king. The ancient capital of Ecbatana, where Astyages held his court and where, according to Herodotus, the horrific banquet of Harpagus took place, lies deeply buried beneath the modern city of Hamadan, its Median and Achaemenid layers largely inaccessible to systematic archaeological excavation. The gold and silver tablets, the column bases, and the mud brick fortifications that have been occasionally unearthed during construction projects in Hamadan confirm the presence of a major Median and Achaemenid royal center, but they do not provide specific information about the reign of Astyages or the events of his dramatic downfall. The physical, tangible world of the last Median king, the walls within which he dreamt his terrible dream of the river of blood, remains largely hidden from us, a lost city of legend that continues to tantalize the historical imagination. The surviving cuneiform references to Astyages, while sparse and indirect, are nonetheless of immense historical value, as they confirm his existence as a real, historical monarch and place him within the broader geopolitical context of the 6th century BC Near East. The Babylonian Chronicle of Nabonidus, as we have discussed, records the revolt of his army and his capture by Cyrus in 550 BC, a contemporary, non-Greek confirmation of the central event of his reign. A fragmentary Babylonian text, known as the Dynastic Chronicle, includes Astyages in a list of Median kings, further confirming the existence of a Median dynasty and the place of Astyages within it. The famous Cyrus cylinder, the foundational charter of the Achaemenid Empire that was buried in the walls of Babylon after the Persian conquest in 539 BC, does not mention Astyages by name, but it refers to the previous, unnamed king of the Medes, whose rule was characterized by oppression and religious impiety, a characterization that aligns remarkably well with the negative, tyrannical portrait of Astyages that has been preserved in the Greek tradition. These scattered, fragmentary cuneiform references are the only contemporary, written evidence that we possess for the historical Astyages, and they stand as a sobering reminder of the vast gulf that separates the meager, verifiable historical facts from the rich, detailed, and morally charged narrative that has come down to us through the pages of Herodotus. The specific events of Astyages' reign, beyond the bare fact of his final defeat, are almost entirely unknown from contemporary sources, leaving a historical vacuum that the Greek tradition, with its colorful and dramatic stories, has filled. We do not know, for certain, how long Astyages reigned. Herodotus assigns him a reign of 35 years, which would place his accession around 585 BC, shortly after the Battle of the Eclipse and the peace treaty with Lydia, a chronology that is plausible but not independently verifiable. We do not know the details of his domestic policies, his building projects, or his relations with the various subject peoples of the empire, beyond the generalized, negative image of a tyrannical and oppressive ruler that is presented in the Greek and Persian traditions. The identity of his queen, the mother of Mandaean, is entirely unknown. The political structure of the Median Empire under his rule, the precise nature of the relationship between the central court at Ecbatana and the vassal kingdoms such as Persia, remains a matter of scholarly speculation and debate. The historical Astyages, the real man who lived and ruled and was defeated, remains a shadowy, elusive figure, known to us primarily through the distorting lens of the legends that his defeat inspired. The dream of the river of blood, which is the most vivid and memorable thing we know about him, may be, in the final analysis, a literary invention, a brilliant narrative device that has served, for over 2 millennia, to transform a relatively obscure, defeated king into an immortal symbol of the self-destructive nature of tyranny. The relationship between the sparse, verifiable historical facts and the rich, legendary narrative can be understood, in methodological terms, as a classic case of the formation of a mythhistorical tradition, a process by which a core of real historical events is gradually overlaid, transformed, and ultimately superseded by a compelling, culturally significant, and ideologically charged myth. The historical core is clear. Astyages was the last king of the Medes. He was defeated by Cyrus of Persia, and his defeat was facilitated by an internal defection within his own army. These facts, confirmed by the Babylonian Chronicle, are the solid, unshakable foundation of the entire tradition. The legendary superstructure, the prophetic dreams, the marriage of Mandaean to the Persian vassal, the exposure of the infant Cyrus, the Thyestean banquet, the secret correspondence through the belly of a hare, the final betrayal on the field of Pasargadae, is a later, narrative elaboration, a brilliant and psychologically acute story that was constructed, over the course of several generations, to explain, to justify, and to mythologize that core of historical fact. The dream of the river of blood is not, in all probability, a verbatim account of an actual nightmare experienced by the historical Astyages. It is a literary device, a powerful, symbolic representation of the underlying historical truth that the Median Empire was destined to be swept away by a rising tide of Persian power. The task of the historian is not to simply discard the legend as fiction, but to analyze it, to understand its function, and to appreciate the profound and enduring human truths that it conveys, while never losing sight of the critical distinction between the historical core and the mythic elaboration. The enduring legacy of Astyages in the historical record is thus a paradoxical one. He is, on the one hand, a historical failure, the last king of a defeated dynasty, a ruler whose reign ended in catastrophic military collapse and the permanent subordination of his kingdom to a new imperial power. On the other hand, he is one of the most memorable and culturally significant figures of the ancient Near East, a character whose name and whose story have echoed through the centuries, not because of his achievements, but because of the magnificent, terrifying, and morally profound legend that his defeat inspired. The historical Astyages is a shadow. The legendary Astyages, the tyrant of the dream and the feast, is an immortal archetype. The ancient world has bequeathed to us few images more powerful and more enduring than that of the Median king, waking in the darkness of his golden palace, his heart pounding with the terror of a dream of a river of blood, a dream that foretold not only the end of his own dynasty but the birth of a new, magnificent, and world-altering imperial order. The king who tried to kill the future became, in his failure, the dark, fertile soil from which the future grew, a tragic, terrifying, an ultimately indispensable figure in the grand, unfolding epic of human civilization. The dream of the River of Blood, with its powerful, visceral imagery of a golden flood that surges from the womb of the Princess Mandain to engulf the entire continent of Asia, is far more than a mere plot device in a legendary narrative. It is a richly layered, multivalent symbol that draws upon deep-seated, cross-cultural associations between water, blood, royalty, and the rise and fall of empires. A symbol that has resonated across the millennia and has been interpreted, reinterpreted, and adapted by countless artists, writers, and thinkers. In the ancient Near Eastern symbolic lexicon, water was a profoundly ambivalent force, simultaneously a source of life, fertility, and purification, and a destructive, chaotic power that could overwhelm and destroy the ordered world of human civilization. The great flood myths of Mesopotamia, such as the story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the biblical deluge of Noah, testified to the deep-seated cultural memory of water as an instrument of divine wrath, a cosmic cleansing that erases a corrupt, sinful world to make way for a new creation. The golden color of the flood in Astyages' dream introduces a further layer of symbolic complexity, associating the destructive waters with the royal metal, gold, a symbol of wealth, power, divinity, and the eternal, unchanging splendor of the monarchy. The golden flood is not merely a destruction, it is a transfer of royal power, a gilded tide that sweeps away the old, corrupt Median dynasty and deposits the golden charisma of kingship upon the new, divinely favored Persian line. The bodily origin of the flood, emerging from the womb of the Princess Mandain, roots the political prophecy in the most intimate and powerful of human realities: the female body, sexuality, and reproduction. The flood is not an abstract, impersonal force. It is a dynastic flood, a tide of royal blood that flows from the daughter of the king, a vivid, almost uncomfortably biological image of the transmission of power through the female line. The dream, as interpreted by the Magi, identifies Mandain not merely as the mother of a future king, but as the very source and conduit of a new, world-spanning power, a role that places her, however passively, at the very center of the cosmic, political drama. The sexual, bodily nature of the dream imagery is made even more explicit in the second dream, the dream of the vine that grows from Mandain's womb and spreads its tendrils over the entire world, a phallic, generative image that complements the fluid, feminine imagery of the first dream. Together, the two dreams form a complete, potent symbolic package: the golden flood and the world-spanning vine, the liquid and the vegetative, the feminine and the masculine, both emanating from the body of the Median princess, both signifying the irresistible, organic, and divinely ordained transfer of world power from the Median dynasty to the offspring of Mandain. The symbolic resonance of the River of Blood extends beyond the specific, political context of the Astyages legend to encompass the broader, universal human experience of violent political change and the traumatic transition of power from one regime to another. Blood, in the language of symbolism, is the essence of life, the carrier of lineage and identity, and the shedding of blood is the ultimate sign of violence, sacrifice, and the breaking of the established order. The transformation of the golden flood into a river of blood in the later, proverbial remembrance of the dream is a natural, almost inevitable, symbolic development, as the gilded tide of royal succession becomes, in the harsh reality of political struggle, a torrent of blood, a civil war that pits grandfather against grandson and that culminates in the defection, slaughter, and overthrow of the Median dynasty. The river of blood is the price of empire, the terrible, necessary sacrifice that must be made to clear the ground for a new creation. The dream, in this interpretation, is not merely a prediction of a specific future event, it is a profound, poetic meditation on the violent, sacrificial nature of all radical political change, a theme that is as relevant to the revolutions and civil wars of the modern era as it was to the dynastic struggles of the ancient Near East. The figure of Astyages himself, as the dreamer of this terrible, symbolic vision, takes on an almost tragic, prophetic dimension, a man who is granted, in his sleep, a glimpse of the cosmic forces that are about to destroy him and reshape the world, but who lacks the wisdom, the humility, or the moral capacity to understand and accept the message. The dream is a true, divine revelation. It accurately foretells the future. Astyages, however, misinterprets its meaning. He believes that the dream is a warning that can be avoided, a threat that can be neutralized through his own, decisive, human action. He does not understand that he is not the protagonist of the drama but a supporting player, an instrument of a larger cosmic purpose. The tragedy of Astyages, which is the deep, enduring psychological power of the narrative, is that his desperate, violent attempts to thwart the prophecy are the very mechanisms by which the prophecy is fulfilled, a perfect, closed loop of doom that the Greeks would have recognized as the inescapable machinery of Moira, of fate. The dream of the river of blood was not a warning, it was a sentence, and the king who tried to dam the river was, in the end, the one who opened the floodgates, unleashing the irresistible tide that would sweep him and his dynasty away into the oblivion of history. The enduring, cross-cultural power of the image of the prophetic dream of a flood is evident in its continual reappearance in the literature, art, and even the political rhetoric of subsequent ages, a symbol that can be adapted to serve a wide variety of ideological and narrative purposes. In the biblical tradition, the dreams of the Pharaoh in the book of Genesis, interpreted by Joseph, serve a similar function, using the imagery of abundance and famine to foretell a divinely ordained political and economic transformation. In the Roman world, the dreams of emperors and generals, recorded by historians like Suetonius and Plutarch, are frequently used to legitimize or foreshadow the rise of new dynasties and the fall of old ones. In the modern era, the imagery of the flood and the tide has been a staple of political rhetoric, used to describe everything from the migrations of peoples to the rise of revolutionary movements. The dream of Astyages, the oldest and most vividly detailed of these ancient prophetic flood narratives, stands at the head of a long, rich, and immensely influential tradition, a testament to the enduring, universal human need to interpret the chaotic, violent events of history through the lens of powerful, resonant, and ultimately meaningful symbolic narratives. The river of blood, which began as a private, nocturnal terror in the bedchamber of a Median king, has flowed, through the channels of historical memory and artistic imagination, into the vast, deep, and ever-flowing river of human culture. The geopolitical transformation that was unleashed by the fall of Astyages and the absorption of the Median Empire into the new Persian state was one of the most rapid, dramatic, and consequential shifts in the balance of power in the entire history of the ancient Near East. A tectonic realignment that, within a single generation, completely redrew the political map of the known world. The Median Empire, during the brief century of its dominance under the dynasty of Devours and Cyaxares, had been the arbiter of power from the Halys River in Anatolia to the borders of the Parthian steppes, a formidable military power that had annihilated Assyria, fought the Lydian kingdom to a negotiated peace, and established a loose, feudal hegemony over the diverse Iranian tribes of the plateau. The sudden, dramatic collapse of this established order, and the seizure of its vast resources, its seasoned military apparatus, and its network of diplomatic relationships by the ambitious, previously subordinate Persian kingdom of Anshan, was an event of such seismic significance that its shockwaves were immediately felt from the Aegean Sea to the Indus Valley. The dream of the river of blood, which had been a private, prophetic vision of a dynastic transition, had, in its fulfillment, become a geopolitical reality, a flood of Persian power that was now poised to inundate the entire continent of Asia. The immediate consequence of the Median collapse was the complete and utter destabilization of the established international order, as the former vassals, allies, and tributaries of the Median crown found themselves suddenly adrift in a world where the old certainties had been violently swept away. The Lydian kingdom of King Croesus, the fabulously wealthy ruler of Sardis who had been bound to the Medes by the solemn treaty of the Battle of the Eclipse and the marriage alliance between the two dynasties, now faced a new, aggressive, and militarily potent neighbor on his eastern border, a Persian empire that had absorbed the formidable Median cavalry and that was led by a young, charismatic, and divinely favored conqueror. The Greek cities of the Ionian coast, which had been tributaries of the Lydian kingdom, and which had enjoyed a precarious, negotiated autonomy, found themselves directly in the path of the expanding Persian power, a storm that would soon engulf them in the campaigns of Harpagus. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, which had been the ally of the Medes in the destruction of Assyria and which had divided the spoils of the fallen empire with Cyaxares, now watched with growing alarm as the Persians consolidated their power on the Babylonian eastern frontier, a threat that would culminate, less than 2 decades later, in the bloodless conquest of Babylon by Cyrus in 539 BC. The fall of Astyages was not an isolated event, it was the starting pistol for a generation of world conquest. The strategic genius of Cyrus the Great lay in his ability to recognize, and to ruthlessly exploit, the immense, inherited advantages that the conquest of the Median Empire had placed in his hands, combining the martial traditions of the Persians and the Medes into a single, unified, and seemingly unstoppable military machine. The Median heavy cavalry, the cataphracts who were the most feared mounted warriors of the age, were now the elite striking arm of the Persian army, their long lances and their armored steeds a terrifying instrument of shock and destruction. The Median infantry archers, whose mass volleys had been a decisive factor in the fall of Nineveh, provided the missile power that softened up enemy formations before the final, devastating charge. The network of Median royal roads, the administrative structures of the satrapy system, and the accumulated experience of the Median bureaucracy were all seamlessly integrated into the new Persian imperial apparatus, providing the logistical and organizational capacity to project military force across vast distances. The Persian Empire, which was often portrayed by the Greek historians as a sudden, miraculous creation of the genius of Cyrus, was, in reality, the brilliant, accelerated maturation of a political and military system that had been built, tested, and refined by the Medes over the course of the preceding century. The shadow of the Medes was the very engine of Persian power. The diplomatic and ideological consequences of the Median fall were as significant as the purely military ones, as Cyrus and his successors masterfully wielded the narrative of the tyrannical, doomed Astyages to legitimize their own rule and to present themselves as the restorers of order, justice, and divine favor. The story of the prophetic dream, the exposed infant, and the cannibal feast was not merely a Persian domestic legend, it was a powerful instrument of international propaganda, a narrative that was disseminated to the subject peoples of the empire and to the neighboring kingdoms as a justification for the new world order. The Persian kings, in their inscriptions and their diplomatic correspondence, consistently presented themselves as the agents of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god, who had raised them up to overthrow a wicked, unjust, and impious ruler and to establish a reign of law, order, and prosperity. The Babylonians, who had suffered under the erratic and unpopular rule of their own king, Nabonidus, were offered a similar narrative. Cyrus was not a foreign conqueror but a liberator, a king chosen by the god Marduk to restore the proper worship of the temples and to protect the people from oppression. The fall of Astyages, the dream-driven, self-destroyed tyrant, was the template, the cautionary example, that the Persian kings invoked to demonstrate the fate of those who defied the divine will and oppressed their subjects, a powerful, persuasive message that smoothed the path of conquest and facilitated the integration of diverse peoples into the new, universal empire. The ultimate geopolitical legacy of the fall of Astyages was the creation of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the largest and most administratively sophisticated state that the world had ever seen, a transcontinental colossus that stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea and from the Central Asian steppes to the cataracts of the Nile. This empire, which would endure for over 2 centuries and which would profoundly shape the political, cultural, and economic development of the entire ancient world, was not, in its origin, a Persian creation alone. It was the product of a Perso-Median synthesis, a fusion of 2 closely related Iranian peoples whose destinies had been inextricably intertwined by the prophetic dreams of a tyrannical king. The empire of Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes, the empire of the immortals, the royal road, and the magnificent palaces of Persepolis, was built upon the foundations that had been laid by Deoses, Phortes, and Cyaxares, and its very existence was a testament to the profound, enduring, and world-altering consequences of the dream that had haunted the sleep of the last Median king. The river of blood, which had begun as a torrent of dynastic violence in the highlands of the Zagros, had, in the fullness of time, become a golden tide of imperial power that would wash over the entire known world, leaving a legacy of cultural and political transformation that continues to shape the modern Middle East and the entire fabric of Western civilization. The legacy of Astyages and his prophetic nightmare in the art, literature, and political thought of the Western world, from the Renaissance to the modern era, is a fascinating and often overlooked chapter in the long afterlife of the classical tradition, a story of how a single, vivid, and morally charged narrative from the ancient Near East was transmitted, transformed, and deployed to serve a wide variety of ideological, artistic, and philosophical purposes. The recovery of the Greek historical texts during the Renaissance, particularly the histories of Herodotus, which were translated into Latin and widely disseminated among the educated elite of Europe, brought the dramatic tale of the last Median king to the attention of a new generation of scholars, writers, and political thinkers, who found in the story a rich source of exempla, moral lessons, and timeless political wisdom. The figure of Astyages, the tyrant who was destroyed by his own cruelty, and the figure of Cyrus, the virtuous, divinely favored founder of a great empire, became standard models in the educational and political literature of the period, used to illustrate the dangers of tyranny and the rewards of just, enlightened rule. The Italian political philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli, in his seminal work The Prince, written in the early 16th century, drew extensively on the classical historical tradition, including the story of Cyrus, to develop his revolutionary, pragmatic theory of political power. For Machiavelli, Cyrus was the perfect example of the new prince, who rises to power through his own virtue, his ability and strength, and through the favor of fortune, a man who, by his own talents, could seize the opportunity presented by a weak, corrupt, and decadent regime and establish a new, powerful, and durable state. The story of the exposed infant, the survival against all odds, and the final, triumphant conquest of the Median Empire was, for Machiavelli, a powerful illustration of the role of fortune in human affairs and the necessity for a prince to be bold, decisive, and willing to take risks. The dark, cautionary tale of Astyages, the tyrant whose cruelty alienated his most loyal followers and created the enemies who destroyed him, served as a negative example, a warning of the fatal consequences of misusing power and underestimating the resentment of the oppressed. The dream of the river of blood, in this Machiavellian reading, was not a divine prophecy but a symptom of the king's psychological weakness and the impending collapse of a state that had lost the support of its own nobility. The visual arts of the Renaissance and Baroque periods also occasionally turned to the story of Astyages and Cyrus for subject matter, although far less frequently than to the more familiar stories of the Bible and Greek mythology. The episode of the exposed infant Cyrus, the future king being discovered and rescued, was a popular theme for paintings and decorative arts, as it combined the pathos of the helpless child with the dramatic promise of a glorious future, a classic narrative of hidden royalty that resonated with the dynastic preoccupations of the European courts. The horrific climax of the story, the Thyestean banquet at which Harpagus is fed the flesh of his own son, was a less common subject, but it did attract the attention of a few artists who were drawn to the dark, macabre, and morally transgressive potential of the narrative. The story's powerful, visceral imagery, the golden flood, the world-spanning vine, the severed head and hands of the innocent child, provided rich material for artists seeking to explore the extremes of human emotion and the terrifying consequences of absolute power. The dream of Astyages, in its various visual interpretations, became a part of the broader European artistic vocabulary of tyranny, prophecy, and divine retribution, a vocabulary that was deployed in countless paintings, tapestries, and book illustrations over the course of the early modern period. The 18th and 19th centuries, with their renewed interest in the Orient and the rise of modern historical scholarship, brought a new, more critical, and more archaeologically informed engagement with the story of Astyages. The decipherment of cuneiform scripts in the mid-19th century, and the subsequent excavation of the ancient cities of Mesopotamia and Persia, opened up a vast new body of contemporary, non-Greek sources that allowed scholars to test, challenge, and refine the Herodotean narrative. The discovery of the Babylonian Chronicle of Nabonidus, with its terse, analytic confirmation of the fall of Astyages, was a pivotal moment in the historiography, providing an independent, contemporary anchor for the Greek tradition. The archaeologists, digging at sites like Tepe-Nush-i-Jan and Godin Tepe, began to uncover the material remains of the Median civilization, giving physical, tangible reality to a people who had previously been known only through the words of their enemies and their successors. The dream of the river of blood, which had for centuries been a literary and artistic motif, was now confronted with the hard, physical evidence of the historical world in which it was set, a confrontation that enriched and complicated, but did not diminish, the enduring power of the legend. In the modern era, the story of Astyages and Cyrus has continued to resonate, appearing in historical novels, popular biographies, and even in discussions of political leadership and the psychology of tyranny. The figure of the tyrant who is destroyed by his own paranoid cruelty, who creates the very instrument of his downfall through his own monstrous acts, has proven to be a timeless and perpetually relevant archetype, applicable to the analysis of political leaders across the globe and throughout the ages. The dream of the river of blood, the vision of an unstoppable, world-altering force that sweeps away the old order and gives birth to the new, remains a powerful metaphor for any age of radical, transformative change. The ancient Median king, who woke in terror in his golden palace over 2,500 years ago, has become a permanent resident of the human imagination, a dark, cautionary figure whose story is retold, in new and ever-changing forms, to each successive generation, a testament to the profound, enduring, and universal power of a truly great narrative. The shadow of Astyages, the dreamer of the terrible dream, stretches from the ancient Zagros mountains across the vast expanse of human history, a dark, fertile thread woven into the rich, complex tapestry of our shared cultural heritage. The legacy of the last Median king and his fateful conflict with his grandson Cyrus extends far beyond the specific, dramatic events of the 6th century BC, permeating the very structures of the Achaemenid state that followed and through it, influencing the subsequent political and cultural development of the entire Near Eastern and Mediterranean world for over a millennium. The Persians, who had been the subordinate vassals of the Medes, adopted and meticulously preserved the core institutions of the Median Empire, not as a conquered, alien system, but as the legitimate, honored foundation of their own, vastly expanded imperial project. The satrapy system of provincial governance, which was systematized and perfected under Darius the Great, had its origins in the loose, feudal arrangements of the Median period, where local dynasts and vassal kings were bound to the central authority by oaths of personal loyalty and the regular payment of tribute. The title of the Achaemenid monarch, the Shahanshah, the King of Kings, was a direct conceptual inheritance from the Median imperial tradition, reflecting a multi-tiered, supranational sovereignty that had been pioneered by the kings of Ecbatana. The dream of Astyages, the prophecy of a flood that would sweep away his dynasty, was, in this institutional sense, a prophecy that was fulfilled not in destruction but in the triumphant preservation and expansion of the Median imperial model. The religious and cultural institutions that had been nurtured at the Median court, particularly the powerful, influential priestly caste of the Magi, were not merely tolerated by the new Persian rulers. They were elevated to a position of central, official importance within the Achaemenid state. The Magi, who had interpreted the terrible dreams of Astyages and who had, according to the Greek tradition, played a pivotal role in the events leading to his downfall, became the official priests of the Persian Empire, the guardians of the sacred fire, the custodians of the Zoroastrian ritual, and the essential officiants at all royal ceremonies. The Zoroastrian religion, with its dualistic cosmology and its emphasis on the cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, order and chaos, was not a Persian imposition upon a foreign, conquered people. It was an Iranian tradition that the Persians and the Medes had shared, and which was now elevated, under the patronage of the Shahanshah, to the status of the imperial cult. The fire temples, the sacred hymns of the Avesta, and the rituals of purification and sacrifice that were administered by the Magi became the spiritual glue that helped to bind the diverse peoples of the empire together under the authority of a divinely favored king. The spiritual shadow of the Medes, the dark, prophetic world of the Magi, thus became the sacred foundation of the Achaemenid imperial ideology. The military legacy of the Medes, which we have traced in detail, was even more directly and immediately consequential, as the formidable Median cavalry, the cataphracts, and the disciplined Median infantry became the backbone of the army that would conquer the known world. The Persian military system, which was so admired and feared by the Greeks, was not a sudden, novel invention but the culmination of centuries of evolution on the Iranian plateau, a process in which the Medes, under the brilliant military reforms of Cyaxares, had played the crucial, decisive role. The combined arms tactics, the integration of heavy shock cavalry with massed archers, the use of sophisticated siegecraft, and the ability to project military power across vast distances were all Median innovations that the Persians inherited, refined, and deployed on a global scale. The army that fought at Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis, the army that conquered Egypt and the Indus Valley, was a Perso-Median army, a military machine that was the product of a deep and successful synthesis of the martial traditions of the two great Iranian peoples. The dream of Astyages, which had foretold the rise of Cyrus, had also, in a very real sense, foretold the creation of this world-conquering force, an instrument of power that was forged in the crucible of the Median-Assyrian wars and that was now wielded by the grandson whom Astyages had tried to destroy. The long-term political and administrative legacy of the Medes, transmitted through the Achaemenid Empire, extended even beyond the fall of Persepolis to Alexander the Great in 330 BC, as the structures of the Achaemenid state were adopted, adapted, and perpetuated by the Macedonian conquerors and their Seleucid successors, and later, by the Parthian and Sasanian dynasties. The Seleucid Empire, which ruled the Iranian plateau for over a century, maintained the satrapy system and the basic administrative apparatus of the Achaemenids, a pragmatic decision that demonstrated the enduring efficiency and resilience of the Perso-Median imperial model. The Parthian Arsacid dynasty, which was itself of Iranian steppe origin, consciously revived many of the traditions of the Achaemenid and Median periods, including the title of Shahanshah, the use of heavy cavalry, and the patronage of the Magi. The Sasanian Empire, which arose in the 3rd century AD, was the ultimate, magnificent fulfillment of the Median Persian imperial legacy, a state that was explicitly and self-consciously modeled on the Achaemenid prototype, and which created a powerful, centralized Zoroastrian church, a magnificent court culture, and a formidable military that would challenge the Roman Empire for over 4 centuries. The shadow of the Medes, the people who had first forged the Iranian imperial template in the crucible of their struggle with Assyria, thus stretches across the entire span of pre-Islamic Iranian history, a continuous, unbroken thread of political and cultural tradition that is one of the most remarkable and enduring phenomena in the history of the ancient world. The ultimate, poignant irony of the Astyages legend is that the king who was so utterly destroyed, whose name became a byword for tyrannical cruelty and catastrophic failure, was, in a profound and paradoxical sense, one of the essential, indispensable architects of the glorious Persian Empire that his grandson founded. Without Astyages' fear, without his prophetic dream, without his desperate, monstrous attempts to murder the infant Cyrus, the specific chain of events that led to the rise of the Achaemenid dynasty would not have occurred. The exposed infant would not have been raised in the harsh, authentic environment of the Median highlands, an experience that forged his character and connected him to the common people. The wronged Harpagus would not have become the patient, implacable, and brilliantly effective architect of the Median defection. The Persian tribes would not have been united, with such revolutionary fervor, behind the banner of a divinely preserved, prophesied king. Astyages, in his blind, furious, and ultimately futile attempt to defy the will of the gods, became the essential instrument of that will, the dark, bloody midwife of the Persian Empire. The nightmare of the river of blood was not a lie, it was a prophecy, and the king who tried to dam the river was, in the end, the one whose actions unleashed its irresistible, world-altering torrent. The shadow of Astyages is the dark, fertile soil from which the golden age of Cyrus the Great, the King of Kings, the Lord of Asia, magnificently and eternally bloomed. We have journeyed together through the dark, labyrinthine corridors of the Astyages legend, a story that has carried us from the glittering, seven-walled palace of Ecbatana to the remote, windswept mountains where a herdsman spared the life of a royal infant, from the horrific, blood-soaked banquet hall where a father was fed the flesh of his own son to the dusty, chaotic plain of Pasargadae where an empire crumbled and a new world order was born. We have witnessed the terrible, self-destructive logic of tyranny, as a king, haunted by a prophetic nightmare of a river of blood and a world-spanning vine, descended into a vortex of paranoid cruelty that alienated his court, murdered the innocent, and created the very instrument of his own catastrophic downfall. We have traced the brilliant, patient revenge of Harpagus, a man whose soul was hollowed out by an unspeakable atrocity, and who dedicated his remaining existence to the cold, meticulous, and utterly devastating orchestration of his tormentor's destruction. And we have seen the rise of Cyrus the Great, the miraculously preserved grandson, who, with the secret backing of the wronged Median nobility, seized his prophesied destiny and transformed the ancient world. The story of Astyages is not merely a chronicle of dynastic change, it is a profound, timeless, and deeply unsettling exploration of the nature of power, the psychology of fear, the inescapable machinery of fate, and the world-altering, catastrophic consequences that can flow from a single, terrible act of cruelty. The historical reality that lies beneath this magnificent, morally charged legend is, as we have seen, more complex and more elusive, but no less significant. The contemporary Babylonian chronicle of Nabonidus confirms the essential, indisputable facts. Astyages was the last king of the Medes. His army revolted against him, and he was captured by Cyrus, who went on to conquer Ecbatana and found a new empire. The archaeological remains of the Median civilization, the fire temple at Tepe-Nushaijan, the columned halls of Godin Tepe, and the scattered, fragmentary cuneiform references, provide the tangible, material evidence that the Medes were not a Greek fiction but a real, sophisticated, and innovative people who pioneered the essential institutions of Iranian imperial governance. The legend of the dreams, the exposed infant, and the cannibal feast is the mythic elaboration, the brilliantly crafted, psychologically profound, and ideologically powerful narrative that was constructed, in the decades and centuries following the events, to explain, to justify, and to make sense of the cataclysmic transition from Median to Persian rule. The story is not true in the literal, analytic sense, but it conveys a deeper, essential, and enduring truth about the fragile, corrupting nature of absolute power and the inevitable, divinely ordained triumph of justice over monstrous cruelty. The dream of the river of blood, whether a historical event or a narrative invention, is a symbol of profound and universal resonance, a vision of the violent, world-transforming tide of history that sweeps away the old and brings forth the new. As we reflect on the long, dark, and strangely magnificent shadow that Astyages has cast across the millennia, we are reminded of the extraordinary power of a great story to transcend its original, specific context and to become a permanent, living part of the shared heritage of human civilization. The tale of the last Median king, transmitted through the elegant, endlessly fascinating prose of Herodotus, has been read, interpreted, and reinterpreted by countless generations of historians, philosophers, playwrights, artists, and political thinkers. It has served as a moral exemplum for Renaissance princes, a source of dark, psychological insight for modern scholars of tyranny, and a wellspring of dramatic, narrative material for novelists and poets. The figure of the tyrant who tries to kill the future and who, in his monstrous failure, becomes the dark, bloody midwife of that future, is an archetype of permanent, universal relevance, a character who can be recognized and understood in every age and every culture. The story of Astyages is not merely an account of a long-dead king in a fallen empire. It is a living, breathing narrative that continues to speak to us, with undiminished power, about the deepest, most urgent, and most terrifying questions of power, fate, and the human condition. The river of blood, which began as a terrifying, private vision in the sleeping mind of a Median king, has, over the course of 2,500 years, flowed into the vast, deep ocean of human culture, its dark, potent waters mingling with the myths, legends, and histories of countless other civilizations. The king who dreamt the dream is long dead. His magnificent, seven-walled capital lies buried beneath the streets of a modern city. His empire, which once dominated the Near East, is but a faint, scholarly memory. Yet his story, the legend that his downfall inspired, remains vibrantly, forcefully alive, a testament to the astonishing power of narrative to outlast stone and gold and to preserve, across the gulf of millennia, the essential, terrifying, and redemptive truths of the human experience. The shadow of Astyages, the dreamer of the terrible dream, is not a mark of obscurity or oblivion. It is the dark, fertile, and eternal ground from which the brilliant, enduring light of one of the greatest stories in all of human history has shone, and will continue to shine, for as long as human beings are fascinated by the mysteries of power, fate, and the dark, hidden recesses of the human soul. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.